Women of Reddit, what was your worst run-in with a creep? 14 years old and alone on the subway. Man sits in a seat across from me, spreads his legs, and starts self-pleasuring through his pants while staring me straight in the eyes. I was getting ready to jump up and run out at the next stop. An older gentleman suddenly appeared, stood directly in front of me like a shield, and stared the guy down. At the next stop, he pointed to the door and made him get off. I hope I said thank you, but I was in shock. So thank you, dear man, who protected me and made me feel safe. Story 2. When I was in elementary school, I used to follow around a couple neighbors whenever I had a spare minute. One was in his 70s, taking care of his 95-year-old mother. He couldn't leave her home alone, so he was always around. He showed me how to keep bees. The other was a middle-aged divorced man who missed his kids terribly when they were with their mom. He and his wife just dotted on me. I told one of them about a nice man at church who wanted to be my friend. He grabbed the other, and both men absolutely came unglued. I never saw that guy again after that and can't even remember what he looked like, but I remember how upset these two men were. I cried when one of them said, "Grown men don't make friends with 6-year-olds," because they were my friends. They just hugged me tight, said it was different, and carried me home to my parents. Good guys are amazing and incredible parts of a community. Story 3. A few years ago, I lived in a tiny condo right next to a few trails in San Diego. I was on a pretty strict running and hiking routine. One night, it got dark faster than expected. A man who appeared to be about 6'3" and 200 pounds approached me as I was nearing the end of my hike. He told me, with a smirk on his face, to be careful, as there are many things that could hurt me when the sun goes down. The next day, as I'm exiting my back gate, he's standing there as if he's waiting for me. He introduced himself and admitted he's been watching me for a while. I decided to pretend like I was grabbing something from my car and went back into my house. For the next few days, I see this guy circling my condo, looking in if the curtains are open. He was always walking around day and night. I checked the Megan's Law website and, surprise, there he was. Multiple charges, including SA by force or fear and CP. I decided to contact his parole officer, and he immediately returned my call, stated he could tell I fit his MO and to use extreme caution. He said he would do what he could to try to get him out of the neighborhood. After that call, I thankfully never saw him again. Story 4. So, last year I got a flat tire on a semi-busy road when a snowstorm started. Since I had AAA, I figured I would use one of my roadside assistants to have them replace the tire with the spare that I had, and I wouldn't have to go outside since I forgot gloves. While I was waiting, a mid-40s, early 50s man came up to my window and asked if I needed help. Thinking he was just a good Samaritan at the time, I thanked him but told him no, I was just waiting for AAA. Now, if he left here, I would have a nice story about a guy willing to help me with a car problem. Instead, he gets downright pushy. He lives nearby. I can just take my car there and change it in his garage. Why don't I just stay in his house until AAA comes? I kept telling him no, and he starts yelling, and I rolled up the window and he starts pounding on it. Eventually he left when the AAA guy came, but I still took a very long and circuitous route home. Story 5. There was a thread about this kind of thing in my neighborhood recently. Some guy was driving around telling women who were in their cars alone to roll down their windows. Once they did, he would tell them that it looked like their back tire is flat and that he was a mechanic. He would then follow them as they pulled over onto a side street. The woman who wrote about it said that she realized what was going on because the guy wasn't wearing mechanic clothes and gave off bad vibes. So when he came over to her car, she kept her window rolled up and he started yelling at her. She drove away, luckily, but when she posted about it, at least 10 other women confirmed that they had similar experiences. It's so effing awful that we aren't even safe to be alone in our cars by ourselves. Her tire wasn't flat, to be clear. Story 6. Almost the exact same thing happened to me last fall. I locked my keys in my car, so I called AAA since I have roadside assistance and waited. I was at a grocery store standing in the parking lot when this guy comes up and starts talking to me, asking me what happened. I told him I locked my keys in the car and was waiting for AAA to get here. He asks, "Oh, where do you live?" And I stupidly told him, and he says, "Oh, cool, I grew up in that neighborhood, so I know the area well." I just kind of smiled and nodded, and he asked if I needed a ride home. I said, "No, I'm waiting for AAA, but thanks." He then just kind of stood there in silence, which was extremely awkward because he was holding his bags of groceries and I was leaning against my car. This went on for almost 5 minutes before he finally walked away. But I saw him sitting in his car and looking over at me every few seconds, so I ended up going into the store to wait. Weird experience. Story 7. I was 8 years old and waiting for the bus in the morning to go to my mom's work. A guy sat next to me at the bus stop and his bus pass was the wrong color. expired. He told me he loved me, and as scary as it is, I said thank you. When the bus finally came, I got on first, and the bus driver lady immediately shut the door behind me. He said the man knelt down to try and look up my shorts and that he wouldn't be taking the bus with us. I told my mom, and after work, we went and bought me my first pepper spray as a effing 8-year-old. Story 8. When I delivered pizzas and I was 18, this guy asked me if I wanted to step in while he grabbed his money. It was cold and rainy, so I took him up on the offer. He ended up trying to keep me there till his mom got home because he didn't have enough for the pizza. He tried to force me into a pyramid scheme and kept making uncomfortable comments about me. I had left my phone in my car, so I couldn't text my manager to call me to give me an out because no matter how hard I tried to leave, this guy would find some way to block my path. I took off when he went to the bathroom and told my manager about what happened. Females weren't allowed to deliver to him anymore. We eventually found out that he was a convicted SA offender too. Normally, I find an out and I always have an escape plan, but I put myself in a position where I couldn't give myself an escape. I went on to manage/deliver pizzas for several years, but after that day, I implemented a new rule which was never enter anyone's home unless I knew who it was. I'd stand in the pouring rain any day over entering a stranger's home. I come from a safe, low-crime area, but my gut instinct that night was that I was in danger. Story 9. I'm a male, and the customer I delivered to, also a male, got pretty creepy with me. The first time I delivered to him, he invited me in to put the pizzas down while he got his cash, and everything seemed totally normal. The second time I delivered food to him, he wasn't answering the door. I called the number on the slip, and finally he came saying he'd fallen asleep because he took a Benadryl after getting bit by a spider, but he was really just trying to get my phone number on caller ID. I didn't go in that time because I had another order to deliver, but as I was walking back to my car, he asked if I could get him a pack of cigarettes at some point on my travels. He'd tip me another $10. That never happened. Then he called the store at the end of my shift and asked if I, quote, left a watch at his house. Then he'd call my phone with his number blocked, say something like, "Hey, wanna F?" Hang up, then call with his number unblocked so my caller ID would get it, but he'd hang up once I answered. He did that a few times in the same day, so I called the cops, but finally called him back and told him to stop. I don't think he ever ordered food from our restaurant again. Story 10. Worked at a library for a while and had a student's dad. Mind you, this was maybe a year or two after I graduated. Hit on me and tried to follow me around the library. We also fired a security guy for looking up adult films in the children's section of the library. Edit. He was going to adult film sites on the computers in the children's section of the library. Worked at a dental office and one of the repair guys decided my being polite and joking with him was flirting and pushed me against a counter and kissed me with tongue. Ugh. I still remember he tasted of infection, and I was glad I moved right after that. Shudders. Story 11. A guy who stays regularly at the hotel I work in. All the female staff know how to avoid getting caught alone with him. He has a habit of asking us if we know of any adult fun nearby. If you just act like you don't know what he's talking about, he'll say he wants to go to brothels and have a good time without his wife. He'll then progress to offering you various amounts of money for the night and asking you what you like in bed and what you'd be willing to do. He developed such an obsession with one of our staff before she left that security would walk around with her when he stayed because he'd followed her out to her car at one point making suggestive comments. Got stuck alone with him once as I was behind the counter and he stood blocking the only way out from behind it. He started the casual chat and I told him I wasn't interested. He then moved on to asking me what time I finished, if I lived nearby, if I walked home alone. My male coworker turned up then, but he creeped on me from a distance the rest of the day and watched me leave. I have no doubt he will assault someone one day. Hotel won't ban him because he regularly spends money. Edit. I woke up to so many replies on here. Quite a lot of people are telling me to share the name of the hotel so they can leave bad reviews. The thing is that it's probably already not in the best financial place due to the pandemic, and tanking it that way could result in a lot of people losing their jobs. It's badly managed, but I do have coworkers I don't want to put in that position. I hadn't thought of the police as being useful in that kind of situation, but it's a good idea. Even the mention of reporting to them may force the managers to act. My department's manager, who had a tendency to tell us to, quote, suck it up, was replaced just before the pandemic. The new manager is female, so I'm hoping she'll be more sensitive to the situation and push upper management to act next time. So I'd like to echo the sentiments of, looking into getting this guy banned from the hotel, if not arrested. And honestly, like, I understand the nobility of wanting to protect your friends' jobs, but like, nobody's front desk job at a hotel is worth someone potentially getting SA'd down the road. This guy needs to face consequences for what he's doing before it escalates to the next level and someone ends up being seriously endangered or hurt by this. So, don't worry about the jobs. You got to get this guy off the streets. Story 12. Weird Larry lived in my dorm. He unsuccessfully hit on all the girls, which is why he was Weird Larry. It totally ruined his self-esteem. One night, Larry just showed up and invited himself into my room. I was not fully clothed. He took this as an invitation and climbed up into my bunk bed. I asked him to get down, and he asked me to come up there with him so we could have sex. When I refused, he took some quarters out of his pocket, put them on my nightstand, and said, "What if I paid you? You could do your laundry." I told him that wasn't enough change to do a full load of laundry, and he started crying and getting snot all over my pillow. We had to go wake up the RD, person in charge of the dorm, and have him escorted out. Then he wouldn't stop sending me messages. They became more desperate until they became threats at SA. I saved the messages and used them to file a restraining order. A few other girls wanted in on it, so Weird Larry was evicted from his own dormitory and had to drop out of school. Story 13. The most memorable was when I was sitting in my parents' front garden, on the swing, reading. The way everything is laid out with the trees and whatnot, you can barely see the swing/deck/barbecue area from any perspective that's not from the front door. Very private spot. Anyway, I was just sitting there reading when I hear someone walking up. I assume it's a family member because how would it not be? Someone plops down on the swing next to me, throws an arm around me, and it's just some effing guy. Says some stuff, tries to move closer, and proceeds to attempt to keep me from leaving when I get up. I get the F out of there, practically sprint back to the house and tell my dad what just happened and that there's some a-hole in our garden being completely gross at me. He just laughs and says, "Oh, that's just new across the street neighbor. Be nice." The F? Over the next couple years, Craphead would go on to make me and my older, only occasionally visiting sisters super uncomfortable any chance he got. Long stories, and his poor but large and angry dog was always loose in the neighborhood and murdering other people's pets. That mother effer still makes my blood boil. Okay, so the creep is one thing, is what it is. He's a creep. But my God, like, what is wrong with your dad? If my daughter came to me and told me that, like, that guy would be getting his absolute arse beat into the ground. Why are you just brushing off your daughter hinting that some weirdo neighbor is potentially about to SA her? That's terrible. Terrible parenting. Story 14. I was walking my dog and made the mistake of not rushing home okay once it got dark. A man in a baseball cap and oversized jacket blocked my path to comment how pretty my dog was and how I must take good care of him. I smiled tightly and thanked him, told him to have a good day and nodded and went to go around him. So he naturally grabbed my arm and said, "Yeah, I bet you take real good care of anything you have. You married?" I lied and said yes. He let me go, but followed me home. I wound up calling my boyfriend to come pick me up. Story 15. Used to work with this old man who would touch me all the time on my arm or my back. It's hard for me to make a scene, although I wish that I had been direct with him. My solution was to shuffle away from him any time he got close to me. It did seem to fix it, but he was kind of a chicken afterwards. Also, same job, I was kissed on the neck by another coworker very suddenly. This guy was not from the US, so I chalked it up to cultural differences, but I did not view him the same way afterwards. Story 16. I worked at a grocery store when I was younger. One day, the district manager came in. I was stocking the floor, so I was crouched down putting stuff on the shelves. All of a sudden, I feel someone grab my ponytail and start playing with it. I turn around to start yelling and realize it's the DM. I was so pissed off. What makes it even weirder is even though I'd seen the guy around and knew who he was, I'd never had a conversation with or interacted with him in any way. Why the hell did he think that was an acceptable thing to do? I'll never know. He was so weird. He didn't say anything to me. He just walked away and I stood there flabbergasted that it just really happened. Story 17. I was 21 in a strange city and got separated from my friend at a bar. I was drunk and wanted to go back to the hotel, so as I'm leaving, this guy who had been sitting near me all night followed and got in my cab with me and closed the door. Again, I was very drunk, so had to think quickly and stay as calm as possible. He tried to talk to me and I just nodded and made small talk. I didn't know if rejection would turn him violent, so I played along the best I could, after telling the driver where to take me. The whole time, this guy is moving closer and touching me, so as soon as the car stopped, I got out, ran into the hotel lobby where I knew this man would be following me, and screamed to the hotel security and desk employees, "I do not know this man! He's following me!" And they took it from there. Story 18. In 5th grade, after ballet practice, I was only wearing shorts and a jacket over my dance clothes, leotard and tights, and standing in a Chipotle line. Some old dude was behind me and asking me about my phone. According to my mother, he was looking at my body, scanning it up and down. Even before I found that out, he gave me the creeps. When we left, he rushed to pick up his order and ran out the door after us and followed us home. He stopped following at the last turn. I had trouble sleeping. Story 19. When I was 16, I went to Walmart with some of my siblings. I broke off to go look in the shoe section for some sandals, and as I turned a corner, I almost ran into this guy. Very nondescript, wearing the jumper most guys who worked at the plants near there wore. For some reason, I immediately got a really bad feeling, panicked, and turned around and went to the nearest other section. Took a few minutes to calm down enough to realize that it was the baby section and that I was staring at an infant bouncer for which I had no use. I laughed at myself, put it down to how anxious and socially awkward I was, and then turned around to go back to the shoe section. I then realized that guy was now in the baby section, and that bad feeling came back. What were the odds he actually needed something there? I fled to the women's clothing section, thinking that there was no reason he would appear there. I was shaking, pretending to look at things and telling myself that I was being ridiculous, when he came up behind me and grabbed my behind so hard, his fingers got places I wish they hadn't and whispered something in my ear. He immediately walked away before I could do anything. I listen to those bad feelings now. Frankly, I consider myself extremely lucky. I also really wish I could remember what he said, but everything was kind of roaring and went blurry. I was so panicked. Now look, I know when you're panicked and scared and, in a desperate situation like this, you're not really thinking clearly, but it's just a shame that there's absolutely no consequence for a guy assaulting a girl or a woman like this. He did what he did, and she was so scared that she didn't do anything about it, and, you can rest assured that he's going to do it again. It's just really freaking unfortunate. Story 20. My friend and I were 16 and wandering around at a Sephora in the mall, just swatching eyeshadow and highlighter on our wrists. He was the only guy in the store, and I only vaguely noticed him in the same aisle as us just before we paid. It didn't ring any alarm bells for me whatsoever, because why should it? We picked up our highlighter and went to pay. The girl at the register rung up our items, leaned over, and said quietly, "That guy followed you two into the store and has been watching you in each aisle. I'm going to give you your bags and go ask him if he needs any help. You two need to get as far away as possible. If you see him follow you outside of the store, go talk to security." She handed us our bags, gestured at the door, and walked up to him as we ran out. I hope she gets all the good things in this life. Look, I'm obviously not a woman, but I have to imagine that this is like peak girl code, girl power moment. I mean, good looking out, not only to notice something like this going on, and not only to tip them off that they're being creeped on, but to come up with a plan to get them out of there safely. That's awesome. Girls, look out for each other. That's really cool. Story 21. Lived in a super cheap, super crappy apartment when I was in college. It was a decent city, but the apartment was located in the only bad neighborhood. I was willing to deal with it for $300 per month rent. Because of the price, people constantly moved in and then bailed after a month or two. One of these people was an older, 50s to 60s veteran. He seemed polite at first, but after he had been there a few days, I'd catch him weirdly leaning to watch me from behind a wall when I'd be outside. When my boyfriend wasn't around, he'd wait for me to be outside and then run up to start a conversation. The conversations were usually harmless at first, then would get creepy, like asking what my favorite sex position is and other inappropriate questions. About 2 months in, I was leaving my house at like 10 p.m. and I saw him stumbling around the parking lot covered in blood. I quickly left and never saw him again. However, a few days later, my landlord knocked on my door and was pale in the face. He asked me if I'd seen anything unusual with the guy. I explained that I had and asked why. He said that if I ever see him on the property again, I need to call the cops first, then call him. It took some prying to find out why, and he told me that he just went in to clean out his apartment, and all that guy had in his house was a dirty mattress, a broken toaster, and a full-on sex dungeon. I don't know what all that entailed, but he mentioned the place was full of bondage and restraint type things. It still makes my skin crawl to think about it. Story 22. I was walking to the train station at 9 p.m. in a very isolated area. No one was around. Two men were following me, as I'm sure they knew I was going to the train station, and in order to get there, I had to go through a dark alley. There were two huge men, and I was shorter and also a minor, which was obvious because I had a backpack. They started trying to corner me, and then they asked me questions about where I live and if I live in the area, and then a big family came and the men left. Story 23. Typical guy wouldn't take no as the answer. He was part of the church group I was with at the time. Asked me out, and I said no. Asked me out again. No. Then he started showing up on my college campus just randomly. He didn't go there, so I informed campus police. Then he began showing up at the places my college group hung out at. Some of my bigger guy friends told him to get lost. Then he started showing up where I worked, so some of my friends started hanging out with me at work. He then began showing up randomly at my house, so I called the police and took out a restraining order against him. Luckily, it worked. That said, I'm a much different person now than I was in college. Now it would have stopped at the second no and gone not one bit further. Story 24. A guy at my university followed me around for about 15 years. I have a unique surname. There used to be a way for students to use Pine to find out who else was logged in and where on campus. He would use that command and show up in the computer lab and sit next to me. He looked me up in the phone book and showed up at my parents' house. After a restraining order, you would think it was done, right? Wrong. I was speaking at an international conference in another country. Guess who was sitting in the front row? This was a conference for a very niche scientific field that he was definitely not part of. A few years later, I was at an alumni event with my husband. My husband left the table to go to the washroom. Guess who sat down the second he left? Police were called. It's been a few years since the last incident. Still paranoid. I mean, that's not even creepy, that's just full-blown stalker, especially if this has persisted for 15 years. I'm quite surprised that the police weren't called before that last incident, but hey, you do you protect yourself however you see fit. Story 25. 15-year-old me went shopping and felt a weird touch when I was browsing books. Didn't think anything of it. Then again, another touch. Turned around to see a grown-ass man trying to touch me up in public in the middle of the day in a bookshop. I was so scared. I just stood there staring at him. Me now would have done it differently. Also, a guy approached me at the school gates, maybe 14, and followed me down the roads, but finally left when I wouldn't get into his car. City living can be scary at times. Story 26. I unfortunately have a few stories, but this is one that tops the list. I'm a bartender, and one night I was serving 3 men who work at an Italian restaurant nearby. I was offered a job, which I politely declined. They were my last patrons. I closed out their tab, finished my side work, and had a busboy walk me to my car. As the busboy left in his own car, this black Porsche SUV blocks me in my spot. The window is rolled down, and I realize it's the owner of the Italian restaurant. He asks if I want to go home with him. I decline. He asks if the busboy was my boyfriend, and I lied and said yes. He scoffed and sped off. I hurry and leave to head home. As I pull into my parking lot at my house, I see the same SUV drive by. I woke up my neighbor, who was a military guy, and he said he'd keep an eye out. That night, I found the guy's name online, his Facebook profile, his business profile, his wife's profile, and his phone number. I took screenshots and sent them all to him, telling him not to harass me or I'll retaliate. I never heard from him again. Lesson learned. Always pay attention to your surroundings while driving home. So hopefully when you sent him the messages to leave you alone, you used like an anonymous or a burner account. Otherwise, you would be blowing your own identity in the process of trying to shut him down. So it seems like it worked, but yeah, that's just something, a little bit of foresight, could go a long way there. Story 27. This was many years ago when I was 14 and attending my first semester of Catholic high school in New York. Let me tell you, a young teenage girl in a Catholic school uniform brings the creeps out. I was walking home from the train station and a guy, probably in his 20s, yells from across the street to ask me the time. No problem, he's probably trying to catch a train. So I check my watch to tell him. Suddenly, he's crossing the street towards me and is now walking in my direction. I get a little nervous and start walking faster, but before I know it, he's next to me, asking me if the name of my lipstick shade is sucking red, telling me how he'd love to wrap his hand in my hair and shove my lips onto his and on and on. I whack him with my book bag and sprint like Flojo herself to my apartment. My older brother went out with his friends to try and find the guy. He never told me if they did, but that guy never bothered me again. I'm 43 now and I still remember it like it was yesterday, and I still hardly ever wear lipstick. Story 28. There was a guy in my hometown that would wait outside the high school with the door to his Corvette open, hoping a girl would get in. I lived in the middle of nowhere. To get to my house, I had to walk over a mile on a one-lane dirt road winding through a forest. One day, as the school bus was approaching my laneway to drop me off, the Corvette guy was waiting in my laneway, with his door open. The bus driver wouldn't let me off the bus. He continued to the next drop and told me to go to that house and call my parents to pick me up. This was in the days before cell phones existed. So it sounds like this guy watched a little bit too much Grease growing up. He thinks he's, John Travolta, Danny Zuko or something. Just get a hot car, Grease lightning, baby. Come on, get in the car. What a freaking tool. I hope no one ever got in the car with him and maybe someone slashed his tires. Serve him right. Story 29. I was walking with my children on a secluded riverwalk. I noticed that we were being followed at a distance. I figured this individual may just be enjoying the same path I was. We stepped off the trail onto a scenic dock off the path that overlooked the river. I was showing the girls the ducks and different types of trees. We hung out there for about 20 minutes. However, I noticed the person behind us on the path did not reach us in that time. At that moment, I heard a stick snap off in the woods close to us. I then saw this man hiding behind large shrubs, thinking he was unable to be seen. This man had been watching my children and I for the entire time we had been stopped. He was getting closer, unaware that I could see him. It became apparent to me that we were in danger. I told the older child to grab the stroller and run to the closest public area, to yell for help, and to call 911. I then confronted the man as he came barreling out of the woods. He realized he had been spotted. Story 30. I had quite a few bad experiences, but one was when I was walking on the road with a friend. Two guys came on bikes, slapped my ass very hard, and it really hurt and fled the scene. I was only 15. I was so shocked and screamed loudly, and everyone stared at me. It was so embarrassing. I cried for days. Edit, to the creep that sent me a personal message saying I couldn't handle the Neutron style. Yes, I couldn't. I don't often share my experiences as I think people may not believe or care, but some kind of people of Reddit genuinely seem to care. Stop sending me horrible PMs. Story 31. As teenagers, we, 3 females, were walking to the local park when a middle-aged man started following us. We made it to the park and he came in and actually started swinging, glancing our way occasionally. After a few minutes, we decided we felt too weird and left. He got up and started following us again, so we ran. Found a police officer and told him and gave him a description of the man. It's impossible to tell if he was just maybe a mentally challenged man who didn't know how to talk to people, or if he actually was a creep, but we didn't want to find out. It was a tiny town, half-mile long town center, and we weren't aware of any mentally challenged guys that hung around the area despite being pretty well aware of all the known faces in our town. Story 32. When I was 17, a man who looked to be about in his 30s followed me around a Macy's when I was shopping with my aunt. I did notice him at first because he made eye contact with me a couple of times, but thought nothing of it. After about 30 minutes, he was still lurking around, but again, I just thought it was in my head. My aunt went to check out, and I was browsing around when suddenly the man appeared out of nowhere, handed me a note, and walked away. He wrote that he couldn't stop looking at me and all this other pathetic garbage. At the end, he left his phone number and said he hoped I called him. I remember being so creeped out that this man stalked me and then wanted someone so young to contact him. I did not contact him. I never want to feel like prey again. Story 33. This happened back in the summer of 2017. I was walking to work and was about a half mile away, and it was around 8:45 a.m. This guy in a car slowed down next to me and asked where I was going and if I needed a ride. I politely said no and just kept walking. The dude effing followed me all the way, driving slow, and kept asking over and over if he could give me a ride. I said no several more times, then just ignored him. Luckily, the way to my work was a heavy traffic area with other people walking around. Story 34. Got stalked in college. Date went awkward with a guy, decided not to go on a second one, and he started just showing up in my dorm building. Did not live in my building. Doors were controlled by swiping ID for entry. I'd leave my room to just find him sitting outside my door, even at weird hours. It was corridor style, so I had to leave to go to the communal bathroom. Luckily, the girls' bathroom did have locks on the main floor. I'm also talking finding him at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday. Ran into him at random places on campus, and he seemed to have my schedule memorized. I went on one date, never gave him my schedule, and wasn't even in the same major. To find me most days, he had to go to a fairly remote part of campus that literally took a bus ride and only included classes from my major. This went on for a couple months. My RA, though, noticed him constantly lingering in the hallway, talked to me, and realized quickly he was not an invited guest. She found him outside my room one night and laid into him. He stayed away from me after that. So, in a lot of cases, these creepers really just need someone to confront them. They need a good telling off, as evidenced by this. So, if it's not the person being stalked themselves, just don't be afraid to tell someone else. And I promise you, there are plenty of people out there ready and willing to lay into creeps. So, yeah. Spread the word. People need to know more about stories like this. Story 35. My roommate in the dorms went through something similar. Some guy starts showing up to her classes, not even in our college, let alone major, asking her creepy questions, and eventually it escalates to him giving her back personal items like her student ID card, notebooks, and finally her hairbrush, which means he got into our dorm. He'd sit on a hill facing our dorm room and stare at our window for hours, so we could never open the blinds. One day, she was doing her laundry and stepped away for a few minutes to use the restroom. In those few minutes, someone had picked through their entire load of laundry and stolen every single pair of panties. Security did nothing because he was an international student and we were misunderstanding cultural differences, even though dozens of girls were reporting him for the same type of thing. Eventually, he got expelled because his roommate found a manifesto of his where he wanted to shoot up the athletic center. Story 36. When I worked at Mercedes-Benz as a receptionist, an old man would regularly get his car maintained there. He would never make eye contact, only stare at your chest, and would follow me around the store anytime he saw I wasn't at my desk. I lost my cool when he followed about 6 inches behind me, and when I turned around, he asked if he could have some of my bottled water. WTF? Crazy enough, not the first time a creep has asked to share my water out in public. Story 37. When I was 16, I would walk to college once a week to keep fit, as it was an hour away. One day, I had only just set off, and I was accosted by a guy on a bike that wouldn't leave me alone. I was really shy and anxious, so I tried to be friendly, but he wouldn't leave me alone. He finally said he'd go away if I gave him my number, and I didn't feel like I could say no, so I gave it to him to get him to bugger off and just thought I'd ignore his calls. Fast forward to later in the day, and I had to shut my phone off because he was calling and texting so much. He was sending texts saying that he loved me. When I turned the phone back on, I had 100 missed calls and nearly as many texts. It only stopped after about a week of this. It seriously made me nervous for a long time because he'd originally accosted me so close to my house, and I was scared that he'd see me again and follow me. But I never saw him again. Story 38. When I was 18, my friend and I were driving home around 3 a.m. and we stopped by a gas station to get a snack. We hop out of the car and immediately this guy nearby calls out to me saying, "Brunette, white jacket." He asks my name. I give him a fake one, and my friend and I go into the store. We decided to wait in there until he drove away, but 15 minutes later, he was still there. Eventually, he comes into the store, looks around for us, and approaches me. The guy looked to be around 25 to 30. He smelled of cigarettes, and I backed up closer to my friend, but he took a step forward and proceeded to ask me for my number, saying I was cute, etc. I lied and told him I was a minor, to which he respected and backed off. He then says, "Good to know, maybe next time," and leaves. We watch their car drive away and only leave about 5 minutes after we're sure he was gone. We left the store and got into the car. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I saw his car pulled over on the side of the road. We drove past it and I watched as the car turned on and started following us. I begged my friend to take the long way home because I didn't want to lead him to my house and because the long way passes by a fire station that I would have gone to for help had they followed us that far. Eventually, we lose sight of the car, go home, and I never saw him or the car again. So, in direct contrast to story number 37, where the girl kind of folded under pressure and did exactly what the creeper wanted, this is just the kind of quick thinking on your feet that you have to have, right? Give a false name, say that you're a minor, try to throw him off the trail if he's following you home, or at least try to lure him into proximity of law enforcement or a fire station or something like that. So, bravo, good for you, and glad you're able to get home safely. Story 39. I had picked something up from a dying mall, and I was walking through the mostly empty mall and walked past a guy who said, "Hey, gorgeous." I ignored him and kept walking. He started following me, saying things like, "I'm talking to you." He then asked, "Do you speak English?" This whole time I was walking at a steady pace, just pretending he wasn't there. He started then saying in explicit detail all the things he was going to do to me. I managed to lose him in JCPenney's before going out to my car, but I was absolutely certain if he had managed to corner me, he would have SA'd me. Story 40. I have so many to choose from. I had just received my diagnosis from my doctor, incurable autoimmune disorder, yay. and was at a Starbucks, reading everything I could about this new disease. It was not a pleasant afternoon. Some random guy I've never seen before in my life approaches my table and motions for me to take off my headphones. I thought maybe he needed something, so I took them off and he says, "You would look a lot prettier if you smiled." And then he grins at me, as though waiting for me to, I don't know, thank him for the not a compliment. The 20 things I should respond with went through my head. I'm having a bad day. I'm allowed to not smile. I'm not here for your viewing pleasure. It's none of your goddamn business what I do with my face. The only thing I managed to actually say, though, was F off. He did the whole "I'm horrendously offended" snort and said, "It was just a suggestion, female dog." But he left, so I counted it as a win. But it gets worse. I'm about to go back to my deep dive of how my life is going to be changed by my diagnosis when one of the mom zombies, at the table next to me taps my shoulder. When I looked over, she and her friends were all staring at me like I was a stink under their nose. She said, "That was very rude. F you too, female dog. If you're not going to stick up for me, then mind your own effing business. It's not okay for a strange man to approach a young woman with the suggestion that I smile more. It's not okay for a fellow woman to give him permission to do that to me." The blessing of the pandemic is I haven't had strange men to smile once in the last year. So earlier I gave props for girls looking after girls and honoring girl code and all of that, and this seems to be like a gross violation of that. How can you take the side of the creeper in this situation in general, especially if you're another female? Boo! Story 41. Was working at a convenience store restocking some candy. This way older guy approaches me saying he wishes he could eat candy, but he will get fat. I chuckle to be polite. He then proceeds to ask me where I'm from, considering my name on my name tag. I told him where it's from, a country in Eastern Europe. He lets out a kind of moan and then tells me how girls over there are sexually active really young. He asks me if I drink or party, and I tell him I'm only 17. He says, "Okay, I'll be back in a year. Promise you'll still be here?" I was so scared I went to my manager, told him what happened, and he then proceeds to say, "Whoa, did you bang him?" I quit the next week. Story 42. I was 14 and had a run-in with the school creep in the grade above me. Every girl had a story about him, some much worse than others, but I didn't know who he was at the time. We were both at an after-school function, and I fell off a table I tried to sit on top of. He caught me, and while asking if I was okay in a concerned voice, I noticed that his hand bracing my chest was subtly trying to pull down the zipper on my hoodie. He also tried to steal my money at a different school function some years later. I had to give him my money to buy pizza for the event, and he pretended to forget about giving me the rest of the change, which was a lot. He pretended like it was a joke after I grilled him to cough it up. True scum of the earth. Story 43. I was 14 and just got out of my apartment complex when a guy in his mid-30s asked for directions to a nearby place. He didn't get out of his car, just asked me with his window rolled down, and I told him the directions, and I remember going home happy thinking I helped someone today. Next day, I left my home at the same time I used to go for my classes, when the same man was standing at the same spot as yesterday, now out of his car, leaning on it, and called, "Hey, you gave me the wrong directions yesterday." I immediately felt weirded out. I said, okay, sorry. He said, "It's okay. Are you from here?" "I'm Dennis. What's your name?" My 14-year-old ass didn't know any better, and I said my real name. And the next thing he asked me is, "Are you on WhatsApp? Could I get your number? We could talk?" I immediately said no and ran from there. He stalked me for 2 weeks after that, and then eventually stopped. I repeat, I was 14. Story 44. When I moved in, the guy in the flat next to mine invited me round for a couple of drinks, and after about half an hour, started having a seizure. I call an ambulance, we're in the UK, and try to get him on his side. Ambulance crew turn up and take him to the hospital. I let them know I'll lock up and he can pick up his keys when he's better. So next morning he drops by, super apologetic, asks if he can cook for me as an apology. I was kinda not feeling it, but said yes anyway. So I go round to his, and he's cooked something that smells great. We sit down to eat and another seizure. Call another ambulance. Same thing as last time. Next morning, he explains he's got a drinking habit, and the seizures are DTs. I sympathize. My bro is a recovering alcoholic, but I'm not sure we're gonna make great friends. About a week later, I leave for work and he's fitting in the hallway. I call another ambulance, and halfway through the call, he full-on grabs my breast. I tell him to stop a few times, and I can hear the call operator say that they're going to send the police as a precaution. Everyone shows up. I decline to make a statement and give the police the keys this time. Then weird crap starts happening. He suddenly accidentally starts collecting my mail so he has an excuse to see me. There's a fire outside my window, someone listening to me in the hall when I shower. Then after a few weeks, his door is wide open and he's fitting again. I call yet again and police are sent out as well. He goes to hospital and I actually make a statement this time. I end up putting up a few cameras because I feel unsafe. Then about a month later, he snaps. Builders next door woke him up, so his reaction was to slash their van's tires, stab the neighbor's dog, and stab one of the workmen in the leg. I get it all on camera. Police come around asking for the footage, and it was the officer who attended his seizures. He pulled me aside and said that both times, once he got into the ambulance, he immediately stopped fitting. When he got to hospital, he was abusive to staff who said there was nothing wrong with him, and discharged himself. He'd been faking just to get close to me. So yeah, dude went to prison, and I thought it was the end of that, until I realized he'd put my name, address, and phone number into every low-end hooker site he could find. I had to move out pretty quickly after that. Story 45. I was 22 at the time of this story, and this guy was likely twice my age. I'm also a somewhat petite woman who acts a bit younger than I am. I used to work with this chef who, halfway through my employment, started asking somewhat creepy and personal questions. The one that set off alarms was when he asked me in the middle of a shift, "What are your cravings?" I, being somewhat normal, assumed he meant food. He didn't mean food. A few months later, I found myself alone with him. We were looking for something in the kitchen, and he suddenly asked me, "What kind of car do you drive?" Followed by, "Do you drive alone?" It didn't feel normal at all. I've been living with my parents rather than an apartment and innocently answered as much. His whole demeanor and mood changed, like I flipped some kind of switch. He asked if and when I planned to move out and suddenly became disinterested in me after I said I had no plans. Never spoke to me again after that. Then quarantine happened and he apparently quit. I hope I never see him again. Story 46. I was 12 years old, on a public bus and wearing my sailor-esque Catholic schoolgirl uniform. As I was standing near the back door waiting to get off at my stop, a small, greasy-looking adult man sidled up close to me. He had a smarmy little smile on his face. I was so confused as to why he was standing that close that for a few seconds I didn't notice his hand cupping my butt. Fortunately, we were pulling up to my stop, so once I got over the shock of my situation, I hollered, "Don't touch me," and jumped off the bus. Since that day, I've always been very aware of my personal space and have no problem telling people to back off if they're making me feel uncomfortable. Creepy people who prey on little kids are the worst. You know, it's fascinating how at 12 years old, this young lady had the wherewithal to tell off a creeper. That is so cool, so empowering, and I hope that that encourages women that are much older and presumably more capable to do the same. Stand up for yourself, don't take this crap. Story 47. In a park in a foreign country, writing a letter home to my mum, beautiful sunny day. Old man, 70-ish, comes up to me, asks what I'm doing. I tell him, I'm polite. I'm pleased that he can understand me in my third language. Normal conversation ensues. What age I am, 19, what I'm doing in this country, blah blah blah. Then he starts to get weird and I'm confused. I think I'm just not getting his meanings. Not a native speaker, etc., but no, I've got it. He's saying he can't get it up anymore, but women get more out of caresses anyway, and he could make me orgasm that way. He touches my knee. I try to stand up from the bench. He grabs my upper arm. My language skills leave me, and I just open my mouth and scream at him for what feels like a full minute. Just one continuous, unbroken animal howl. He lets go of my arm and I stomp off. I never trusted an old man again. Not the creepiest thing, just the first one that came to mind. Hey, I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do in this situation, right? Even if that's an animal howling scream. I mean, not to make light of the situation, but just envisioning her just going, you know, for one solid minute while he just stands there looking at her like she's nuts. That's kind of entertaining, but no, not making light of SA or anything creepy like that, but I don't know. That story just had sort of a funny spin to it. Anyway, let's move on. Story 48. Time for Dr. Creep. I had my thyroid removed and changed doctors after changing insurance to check to see if everything was still okay. The doctor told me that I was just a paranoid girl who saw a golf ball-sized tumor and freaked out and I shouldn't remove it. When he did the examination of my thyroid, in your throat, he just massaged my shoulders and didn't touch my neck at all. Then sent me home with a diagnosis of chlamydia. This is an ENT. No blood work or anything like that was done. Story 49. I was a moron and took a drink after walking in a club from a guy. Hadn't had one other drink. Drank it, tasted like Jaeger. 20 minutes later, started freaking out to my friend, apparently saying there was someone watching us. We hurriedly went to my car, which was manual, so she couldn't drive it. I shifted and she steered. For some reason, we never called the cops. We apparently were running stoplights and took the interstate, and this guy was following us. We got back to her neighborhood and ran inside as he walked around outside. I fell asleep talking, pee on myself, and couldn't be woken up. She violently shook me, trying to wake me, but I didn't budge. She finally got me awake about 6 hours later to my alarm going off for work. I woke up, 6 a.m., got dressed, went to my car, and wrecked it by running into a bridge. I don't remember anything after about 20 minutes of taking the drink. I still wonder to this day why we just didn't call the cops. Maybe because I was underage? Story 50. The first time I can remember being uncomfortable by a guy was when I was 10. I was riding in the front seat of my mom's car when a semi pulls up next to us. I was wearing shorts, so my legs were visible to the semi driver. He starts honking at us, and so we speed up, thinking that he wants to get over. He speeds up too and stays side by side with us, continuing to honk at us just because he can see my bare legs. This is a current situation. I work at a breakfast restaurant and we have this other gentleman, 50 to 60, and the first time I ever talked to him, he told me a story about his chicken, how he wants Halle Berry as a sex slave, then said that if people don't laugh at his jokes, they need to get a sense of humor. I avoid him as much as possible now. Story 51. Early 20s waiting for a bus. The bus was late. Just turned down getting on an insanely overpacked bus and walked to the next stop as I was in danger of missing my connecting bus. No sooner had I sat down when a guy pulls up to the stop and offers me a ride. I turn it down. He leaves, but circles the block and comes back and offers me a ride. I still turn him down. He proceeds to try and convince me that he does not mean me any harm. He convinced me he meant to harm me by trying so hard to convince me that he didn't mean me any harm. After the second encounter, I make sure my keys are between my fingers and start planning my escape if he gets pushier. I see him drive by twice more without stopping. Connecting bus is late now, and I'm getting very nervous. He stops a third time, trying to get me to accept a ride. I pull the ripcord. As soon as he's out of sight, I jaywalk across the road and go into a grocery store. Probably weirded people inside out as I hide behind a display near the front and look out the windows at the street. I call my SO in a panic and have him pick me up. Story 52. I was at an anime convention with my best friend when we were about 14. Back then, this con only required passes to go into the rooms, not if you were just hanging around in the convention center sitting area. So my mom, who was chaperoning us, sat there with a bag of snacks in her newspaper, and one of us was required to text her, or we would both go check in with her every hour with an update on where we were and what we were doing. This may seem like a lot for a parent to do, but I found out when I was older that my mom knew these events attracted creepers and wanted to give us freedom to walk around on our own while still having her nearby. We went in to watch a panel, and before it started, these two college-age boys sat down on either side of us and started talking to us about the show. Then they started asking what our names were. I remember mentioning we were freshmen, and the guy asked what my major was. I said, no, in high school, thinking it would deter him, and he was just like, that's fine, we're in college, you know? And his friend put his arm on the back of my friend's chair. I pretended to get a text and told my friend, hey, mom is waiting for us, and dude offered, to walk us to the parking lot or something, and I said, no, my mom is at the con with us. We're meeting her outside the room. And I grabbed my friend and we booked it before the panel started. Dudes didn't follow and actually lost interest as soon as they found out my mom was at the con with us. Looking back, this could have gone so badly, and I'm glad my parents would chaperone us like this until we were about 17. Story 53. This happened when I was a freshman in college. I was at the bus stop with a bag of groceries in each hand, just minding my own business, waiting for the bus to go home. Then an older man, must have been in his late 40s or early 50s, starts approaching me and saying really crude things. I should point out that I'm barely over 5 feet tall. This man towered over me and was at least twice my weight. I ignore him, don't say a word. I don't even look in his direction. His comments start getting more sexually explicit the closer he gets. I realize that the longer I stay quiet, the closer he's gonna get, and when he was about an arm's length away, I decided to speak up. Now, what I wanted to do was explain that he was making me uncomfortable and I would appreciate some space, but I must have been all out of patience because what actually came out was, can you back the F up away from me? Oh my God. This grown-ass man acted so outraged that I dared speak to him like that. He starts screaming about how I should respect my elders, how I have no manners, and he actually throws a bottle at me. He missed, It goes on for maybe another 5 minutes, berating me loudly until the bus arrives. Never went to that grocery store again after that encounter. Story 54. Took my son to get a haircut. We went to leave at the same time as another gentleman. I drive a Jeep and so did this guy. I always notice other Jeeps. Said in passing, nice Jeep. Got in and left. Well, we were headed to the store for groceries and I noticed the Jeep following. Got to the parking lot of the store, saw he had pulled in and went to the pharmacy in the same strip. Okay, I think to myself it is possible he was headed in the same direction. I just went in to do my shopping. Was in the store for an hour. Came out and he was still there. This made me take notice. Loaded the groceries, got in and went to leave. Had to pass by the pharmacy and see him pull out right behind me. At this point, I looked at my kid and said, "Hold on, I'm about to take some evasive action." Waited to make the left-hand turn when there was a lot of traffic coming both ways that would delay his departure. Went down the street to the big warehouse store, up and over the hill. Pulled in and parked between two other big trucks to conceal my vehicle and sat there for a good 10 minutes. Story 55. I'm not a woman, I'm actually a pretty large man, and as such, people tend to not mess with me. Being 6'5" does wonders for avoiding conflict. That said, I was dating this girl and we were talking one night and got onto the subject of the kinds of insane things men would say to her as she's just doing something like walking to the grocery store or the thrift shop or whatever. I couldn't believe what she was telling me because it never happened when I was with her, so we devised an experiment. The control was that I was to walk down the street 5 to 10 feet behind her. We lived in a very dense neighborhood. I was to not hold her hand, talk to her, or interact with her in any way. Just pay attention. The crap I heard was horrific. The experiment ended when some douche legitimately propositioned her as if she was a prostitute. That was when I had enough. I was gearing up to F this guy up when she grabbed my arm and said, "No, this is what we do. We just ignore it and we walk away." Realizing that it's a daily thing for her made me really sad and angry, and also made me want to walk with her everywhere. I know that's not realistic and that she can take care of herself, but I was just mortified. Story 56. 2 instances in Italy when I was 17. One was on a water taxi that was packed. Some guy kept on repositioning himself to rub his chicken against my ass. I elbowed him away and he grabbed my waist and kept going. I turned around and asked the man next to me to switch spots with me, and he looked at me with anger in his eyes and told me to just deal with it myself. Luckily, another woman that he was doing that to grabbed my hand and we moved to another part of the boat. Second was on the subway. I was sitting right next to my parents, and the man across from me kept on trying to wave at me and catch my eye. He was staring really hard, and I told my dad. My dad just told me not to make eye contact, but eventually after 10 minutes of him trying to get my attention, I looked at him and made a kind of mean face as he was getting up to leave. He then cussed me out under his breath, left the subway, turned around, and punched the window across from me. Slammed his 2 middle fingers against the window, called me an ugly whore, and beat on the window and doors until the subway pulled away. Story 57. While standing outside a bar, having a cigarette, a friend of a friend kept bugging me to go home with him. He had tried this on multiple occasions, but it wasn't going to happen. Ever. I told him as much, and his response was, "Come on, if you F me tonight, I promise I won't even be racist, and I'll make you toast after." For context, we're both white. I guess he assumed I valued anti-racist attitudes and toast? Which is true, but weird sell, dude. Story 58. The single worst experience of my life. In class, 15, literally just minding my own business, working on something in science class. Feel something light tapping on my shoulder and back. Turn around, some water hits my face. Sound of a guy who was a lot closer to me than I had realized, yelling, "Crap!" trying to put his chicken away and leave the area near my station. He had just ejaculated onto my back. He tried to do it stealthily. The silence afterwards felt like a lifetime, but the teacher grabbed him by the collar, nearly strangling him and dragging him out of the room. I remember crying, a lot. He was apparently expelled because I didn't see him again. I was forced to write something about how it affected me, but I really didn't effing want to dwell on it. It still haunts me. Story 59. I had a guy stalk me at work once. I was 17 and worked at the food court in the mall. By day 2, my manager called security and had him removed. He would stand on the second floor and stare at me. When they removed him, you could hear him screaming I was his girlfriend and it was okay. When I was 20, I worked at the bank in the drive-thru. I had a 50-year-old customer approach me after work. He'd been waiting for me to come out by my car. His wife was a customer too. I once had a disgusting coworker constantly making sexual jokes at me. I hated it. I told him off one day, so he got mad. Later, I was getting food from the Ranch Inn, and he licked me on my neck. I had a guy who followed me into the bathroom once at a party and tried to lock me in with him. He was joking, of course. These weren't the only ones, of course, but the ones that stuck with me the most. Story 60. First and foremost, I have to say that I'm sorry that you women have to put up with guys like this. I got a call from my daughter's principal, grade 8-ish. He said that we needed to talk because she had kicked a boy in the privates. When I asked him what the boy had done, he said nothing, he just tried to kiss her. When I got the story from my daughter, she said that the boy had her pinned against the school wall as he was trying to kiss her and would not stop. I told her she did the right thing and to never hesitate to do that in a similar situation. I then spoke to the principal again and asked what was being done with the boy and had his parents been called, and he said, "Why would I call them? He was the victim." I then had a deep conversation with him about SA. Wish you all well. Be safe. Story 61. I was at a gay bar with some fellow queer friends, all of whom identify as women. It's all relevant. Was just chatting with some guy who was there with friends. Somehow it came up that I had never slept with a guy. Home dude picks me up, drags me to the men's room, and tries to, quote, show me what I've been missing. Thankfully, 2 drag queens helped me beat his ass, but I got kicked out of the bar for making the male patrons act like that. We were banned for a while, too, because we were being slutty straight girls. None of us were straight, and not all of us were born with vaginas, but everything is always the fault of the slut, am I right? Story 62. I've got one, lol. It was at Pride 2019. My friends and I were watching a drag show. They were sitting in front, but I kept letting people stand in front of me. I'm really tall, and I always feel horrible about blocking people's view. So we ended up pretty far away from each other. Suddenly, this huge dude comes up behind me and goes, "Are you married?" My dumbass. No, him. Where do you live? I lied about that, and he goes on to ask me what I was doing after this, and I said I was going home. He goes, "Why don't you come to this club with me? I hear it has great security," which is the #1 weirdest fact to share about a club, but okay. Apparently, my friend's danger senses had gone off and they came to get me. They grabbed me by the hand, claiming one needs to use the bathroom. The guy goes, "Wait, can I talk to you?" Friends give a hard no, and we're off. About an hour later, we're back at the main stage, dancing to some music, when suddenly I feel someone standing really close to me. I turn my head to apologize, assuming my klutzy ass bumped into someone, and you guessed it, it was that guy again, but in different clothes. I booked my ass out of the crowd, and my friends decide it's time to tell security. The security guy says there's nothing he can do, but his husband happens to be the drag queen doing the Lady Gaga concert that day. So I got the satisfaction of seeing that guy getting absolutely chewed out by Lady Gaga. Scary as F then, but luckily nothing came of it, and now it's a funny story. Story 63. Probably the worst was a train creep. I used to get the 7:45 a.m. train that would get me into school for 9 a.m. Was about 16. Some absolute England for the English-looking idiot kept rubbing his chicken at me and spitting out things along the lines of effing tease, stuck-up female dog, etc., etc. Can't remember it exactly because I was 16 and too scared to move onto another seat, so I just let it happen. He went to the bathroom on the train and came out to tell me what he thought of me. Let your mind do the work. I'm 18 now, and the last train creep I ran into kept staring at me, licking his lips, very obviously staring and not just zoning out. Took a photo of him to embarrass him, told him to stop being a creep, and left. He got off at the next stop, LMAO. Story 64. Worked with an older gentleman who had a habit of touching all us girls, a hand on the shoulder, sitting extremely close while on the computer, etc. The day he put his hand on my leg while sitting next to me and leaning into the computer is the day I turned, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Touch me again, even by accident, and I will break each and every one of your fingers." If he saw me coming down the hall after that, he would step into one of the other offices just to avoid being in my bubble. Now this is what you gotta do, ladies. Most of these creepers will fold up like a cheap tent if you just confront them. They are as unmanly and as craven as you could possibly imagine. Just kick them in the nuts, challenge them, go after them, and make them realize that not only are they creeps, but they don't have any power over you. You got this. Story 65. An ex. Dated him to, quote, give him a chance in high school. Broke up with him when he thought it was okay to torture mice before he fed them to his tarantula, and also thought it was no big deal when his friend was drunk and driving. Ran into him at a random about 5 years later, and he invited me to a concert, because one of his friends couldn't make it. All was okay until it was time for me to go home. He claimed he took some drugs at the concert and didn't want to be in my highly patrolled neighborhood. Said he would come down and then take me home. Get to his place in a bad part of town. He starts off by showing me his gun, which he was legally not allowed to have, and starts insisting I spend the night. I said no and headed to the door. He pointed it at me and I forgot what he said, but I laughed and walked out. Halfway debated on throwing him down the stairs if he came near me. I proceeded to walk partway home. Ran into a friend and hung out a bit at their place while the worst of the night was over so I didn't get jumped. Then proceed to walk the rest of the way, nearly 8 miles, home. He ended up driving up behind me and yelling at me to get in his truck. I flipped him off and kept walking. He eventually did an illegal U-turn, peeling out and drove off. Called me incessantly for the next several days. I didn't know I could block numbers on my phone, until I had another friend pose as my boyfriend and shut him down. Then he tried to blow me up on social media through a mutual friend's post, and I blocked him there too. I hope to never see or talk to him again. Never give psychos another chance. Story 66. I was 15 working at Sonic. I worked with a 50-something-year-old man who was kind of scary and had a criminal background already. One day I saw him in the back self-pleasuring. When I reported it the next day to the GM, he told me that this was the 4th time it was reported. He only got fired for stealing months later though. Also, same place, another 50-year-old man kept telling me, "Smile, sweetheart, you'll look prettier that way." And a boyfriend at the time also worked there, and he told me, "If you unbutton your shirt more, you'll get better tips." Etc., etc., etc. Story 67. Not the worst story, but when I was a kid, I knew this guy from my brother's sporting events. His kid also played alongside my brother, and he was in his 40s. Knew me since I was 13 or so. Anyway, as soon as I turned 18, he started messaging me on Facebook, and at first it was to ask how I was doing and what I was studying in school. But then it quickly escalated to him telling me I was beautiful and smart, and I would make a great wife one day, and I'd be a great mother. It really creeped me out. I haven't seen him since, and I hope I never do. Story 68. Mowed the security guard at the building I used to live. It was a bad area of town, so there was always at least 3 security guards working at a time. I was in culinary school and would bring home everything I made, so my neighbors and the security staff regularly got things like buns, pies, cakes, etc. I also smoked, and when Mo saw me, he would come out and smoke in the general area. We never really spoke, but one day he said, "Don't you live at room 222? And you're living alone, right?" Then he tried to kiss me, and I put my hand to his chest to keep him away and told him I wasn't interested, and in fact, I was married. He hit me across the face so hard it broke the blood vessels in my eye. He told me he was in the local gang and I better reconsider, and he left to go back inside. I moved out of the building the next day, paid more for rent for a better area. Never reported it. Effing Mo. Story 69. 2 weeks ago, we had an unusually warm few days in Ottawa. I was wearing a pair of black ripped jeans that are ripped almost the way up and a pair of boxer shorts you can see through the rips. It's a look, lol. But I was walking down the Byward Market with a male friend, and this man walking the other direction stops us and says to my male friend, "Well done, lad, she's a stunner." And as we awkwardly walked past him, he slipped a finger into one of the rips and pulled my pants up so he could see my thigh tattoo and says, "Nice art," before slipping back into the crowd. We were both so shocked, neither of us was able to even react before he was gone. Story 70. I used to work at a thrift store when I was 19, and I was the only daytime person they had for the register, so I was always on the floor by myself. A man who was a regular started to notice me and started hitting on me and asking me questions about my personal life, where I live, my age, do I have Facebook, and would start these conversations with me all while talking on the phone to someone in a different language. It really creeped me out, and he constantly would keep asking for my Facebook or phone number, even after I told him I wasn't interested and that I had a boyfriend. He did this numerous times, and every single time, he'd be talking to me and another person on his phone in a different language. It got to the point where I finally told my manager, and the next time he came in, he lined up at my register, but my supervisor checked him out instead. He kept staring at me, and I ran to the back and cried. He eventually was banned from our store. Women in retail really don't get enough credit for the crap they put up with from creepy-ass men. Story 71. I was sitting near a bus stop after college. I was 17 or 18 at the time, and some guy came up to me and started talking to me as if he knew me. He kept saying sorry, and he was clearly not all there/on something. I kept moving away, and he just followed. He pinned me against the wall I was leaning on and wouldn't leave me alone. I finally got away and sat in the bus stop, and he came and sat next to me. As I stood up to get on the bus, I've never been so happy to see a bus in my life. He grabbed my ass. The worst thing about all this is that there were about 5 or 6 people at the bus stop. Adults, men and women, all saw this happening and didn't do anything to help me. Story 72. I was in ninth grade at the time. It was my 14th birthday and I was coming back from school with my friends. I noticed a weird guy following us halfway through but didn't pay much attention to him. I stopped at my friend's house. She lived 10 minutes away from my house for about 30 minutes, and when I got out, I looked both ways and the guy was there and making some weird gestures. I looked around. There was only me on the road, but I ignored him, thinking maybe he's not well. Got at the pastry shop and I had 2 cakes, one in each hand. This dude stops me right before I go around the corner to my house and says to me in a very low voice, "Why are you acting like you don't know me?" I turned around and said, "I don't know you, just leave me alone." As I go away, this piece of crap gropes me from behind, and having both hands occupied, I pushed him away using my feet. He calls me a crazy female dog, tells me he will get back at me for what I did, and he spit on me. I remember trying to push him again, and someone in the neighborhood opened the door of the house and he went away. I cried for an hour and was so scared after in case I would run into him again. Thankfully, I never met him again, but it was terrifying. Story 73. In a lecture hall just before class started, and the guy behind me decided he wanted to talk to me. That would be fine, but he decided to let me know by grabbing and squeezing the back of my neck. I screamed, jumped up, and started yelling, "No! You don't touch me or anyone like that ever again!" He started blubbering some nonsense about just wanting to talk to me, and so my male friends switched seats with me so I'd be farther away, and another moved right next to the creep to keep an eye on him. I have more stories, but that's probably one of the top 2 creepiest. Story 74. Was waiting for my husband, then boyfriend, who was running late. During the day, but was on a quiet street, drizzling a little. Have earphones. Car pulls past me, then reverses and parks, and a middle-aged man gets out and asks me for directions, and I tell him I'm not familiar with the area. Starts asking me questions like who I'm waiting for, where I am, his ex-girlfriend was also Asian, etc. He's crowding my space a little, but I have my back against the wall. Ironically, my husband runs a martial arts school and I was waiting outside of it. And he starts asking if I want to sit in his car to wait out the rain. He'll take me to a bar. I decline politely. He knows I'm waiting for my boyfriend, but I'm alarmed. These are some serious red flags. So I'm texting my husband with one hand, letting him know some dude is trying to get me in his car. Continues to say things like, "I guess I'm too old for you," but in the next sentence continues to try to convince me to go with him. No one else is on this street. That's when I realized I had to make a difficult choice. Do I escalate or do I stall? About a minute, one of the longest minutes of my life, after I send that text, I hear a car just screeching down the road. Leaving the car running, door flung open, my husband jumps out and the guy takes one look at him and makes a run for it. Husband yells, "Is that him?" And unfortunately, I was so shocked that I freeze and the guy drives away. So I have this thing where I don't really recognize faces, and about 2 weeks later, someone is watching class through the window on the same street. I go to the door and ask if they want to watch inside. We usually have people interested this way. And he says no, but then starts saying something, and it dawns on me, due to his manner of speech, this is the same person. I guess all the guys in class sense something is wrong when I turn back to look at them, because they all started converging towards us, which they usually never do, and the guy again makes a run for it. I should have gotten a license plate, and I think about that a lot. We moved shortly after, although in the same neighborhood. Never ran into him again. Story 75. For context, this happened in 1993. I went on a blind date with a man who was introduced by a mutual acquaintance. I was 28, divorcee. He was a 40-year-old, handsome, locally known professional man. We had a nice time at an oceanfront restaurant, good food, and pleasant conversation. The drive home was also lighthearted, listening to music with the top down along A1A. It was such a wonderful date, and there had been 0 red flags. He was just a nice guy whose company I enjoyed, so I invited him in for coffee. Now, a month before, I had adopted a rescue dog, Black Lab Mutt, who for her entire life had lived on a chain in a yard and was abused and neglected by her male previous owners. Sasha was the sweetest good girl ever with me, but she hated men, which I found out that very night. I unlock the front door and he enters the foyer as I follow. I turn from the closed door. It opens outward. In the moment it took me to turn around, he slams me against the door, grabs my wrists, and yanks them above my head. I'm 5'8", and he was at least 6'3". Then the forced kissing. I was so stunned and terrified, I screamed no and struggled, which he seemed to like a lot. At that point, I hear Sasha stirring her crate in the next room, and I just kind of reacted. I stopped struggling, which got his attention for a second. I managed to give a sexy look and then said that I really wanted to see where this would go, but first I had to let my new puppy out to potty. I told him to stay right where he was so we could resume. I didn't want him to follow me. I earned an Academy Award in the scenario because he bought it and dropped my wrists and stood aside to smack my butt as I walked to the den. I barely pinched the latch and 80 pounds of fiercely protective fury came bursting out. Dummy was still standing at the front door. She lunged and pinned him in basically the same position I had been in. She was snarling, clawing, drooling. She looked rabid. The high-pitched squeal that emanated from his terrified maw was delightful. I slowly walked over. I may have been smiling. He was definitely bleeding from a couple of deep gashes. I hope that shirt wasn't expensive. I held Sasha's collar so she wouldn't tumble out with him, and I reached around and turned the no and said something like, "How do you like it?" As he fell onto the patio, I slammed and locked the door. That Porsche left rubber in my driveway, which was impressive. Sasha got extra treats and scritchins, and I never invited a stranger into my home again. Story 76. So to clarify, I have a degree in the archaeology and languages of the ancient Middle East. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, etc. I had a coffee thermos with the Rosetta Stone on it I got at a museum, and at one point, an older guy on the bus mentioned that he liked it and started talking to me. He followed with, "Did you know there's an ancient Persian version of the Rosetta Stone too, with an inscription in 3 languages? So I had no idea he was a creep. He seemed like a nice guy with the same very niche interest, and we started talking about ancient languages. A little later, he says, "I love to go to the archaeology department on campus and look at the pictures of the graduates on the walls. They're all such pretty girls. Blonde hair and blue eyes. Pretty girls who like to dig around in the dirt and get covered in mud. Ooh, trophy girls. Pretty girls like you." I got off that bus very quickly. Story 77. Waiting at the bus stop near a college campus, so there was a number of people around. A guy, clearly tweaking, is walking down the street, passing people and stopping to talk to people one by one. I have my headphones in, so I have no idea what he's saying. Eventually, he gets to a young girl, must have been a freshman at the college, a few feet from me and starts talking to her. She looks uncomfortable, so I take my headphones out to hear what he's saying. She asks him to go away, and he doesn't, but starts yelling at her. She's practically in tears at this point, and there are plenty of other people at the bus stop, but no one is doing anything. So I go up to them and put myself in between them and tell him to leave. He says, "But I have to ask you a question. If God made women so beautiful, why are men not allowed to self-pleasure to them in public?" All while he's touching himself. I tell him he needs to get the F out of here loudly, and only then do a few guys step in and tell him to leave. By this point, the bus arrived, and I sat with the girl and chatted with her until she got off so she felt better. Most of my stories have to do with public transportation, being followed when I got off or yelled at for not accepting their advances. It was pretty common when I was taking the bus a lot. Story 78. This isn't really the worst in the same way as others in this thread, but it's the first to pop into my mind. I was at a female strip club for a friend's bachelorette party. Another customer saw us, came up to us, and apparently took issue with the fact that I was not actively smiling while watching the ladies dance, so he insisted that I smile. I stared at him. We were in a place where we were surrounded by women whose literal job it was to smile, and he wanted one of the few non-working ones to smile for him. The entitlement. Story 79. One of my bosses went on a sabbatical. I was tasked with handling all his clients. Our IT somehow created a subfolder in my email of his entire inbox/outbox. Before I realized this, I went to search the name of someone outside our firm, and up pops an email to this someone. It has an attachment. I'm thinking it's the exact doc I'm looking for. I click on it. It's an effing picture of me. I still have not felt the shock and violation as I did in that moment. After I calmed down, I realized it was apparently sent from my boss to this other person, and that is how I was able to find it. Within this subfolder of his entire email account that was hidden within mine/searchable in my general account. Story 80. A couple years ago, I was coming home from having dinner with my parents. I think it was a Friday night, and so I was like, treat yourself, and decided to get some ice cream on my way home. I went to my local Rite Aid, which is just around the corner from my apartment. Grab the ice cream, get in line. There's a guy in front of me in line, and when I walk up, He turns around and smiles at me. He was kind of short and stocky, but not unattractive. Not my type, though, and seemed to be around my age or slightly younger. I smiled back because politeness, whatever. I buy my ice cream and walk out. As I walk out, the line guy appears and starts following me to my car. The dude waited until I was done and followed me out into the parking lot. He looks at my ice cream and is like, "Bad breakup? Are you all alone tonight?" I'm like, no, I just like ice cream and kind of want to just get home and chill." Guy can't take a hint, so again, with politeness, I chat with him for a few minutes. He then proceeds to try to convince me to come over to his place and Netflix and chill. He asked me for my number, but I said, "Why don't you give me yours instead?" and took his number and got the F out of there. I realize this is kind of tame and may potentially not seem creepy to people, but the dude not only waited for me in the effing parking lot, he saw what I bought and made generalized assumptions about my effing life as a goddamn pickup line. It didn't just creep me out, it also pissed me off. Needless to say, I deleted that number as soon as I got home. LOL. Story 81. I've had 2 creep encounters in 2020 while taking the subway. First, there was this one guy who went around without a mask on. He came close to me and started spewing these weird sexual innuendos while licking his lips. I had a metal water bottle with me. I grabbed it and yelled that I would break off his teeth if he didn't F off. At first he laughed, but when I raised the bottle in the air, he ran. Second time, I was sitting and this guy pushes himself on me like there wasn't enough room. The wagon wasn't crowded at all, and had his hand caress my thigh. I quickly got up and changed seats. He went to try to follow me, but I gave him the death stare with my fist in combat mode. He sat down and stayed where he was at. If it wasn't for the fact that my friend had initiated me to jujitsu and sparring, I might not have reacted that way. I strongly recommend combat sports, or at least self-defense classes to women. It'll give you the confidence to let people know you're not to be effed with. Could not agree with this more. You gotta learn the jits. Learn how to overpower someone without having to be physically stronger than them. Attack those pressure points, work on those submission holds. I mean, hopefully you never need to use it, but it's always empowering to know that you have that in your back pocket if you're backed into a corner, that you literally can take a grown man down. Story 82. While I was studying abroad in Rome, my roommate and I were on a bus trying to get back to our place. Our professor warned us about this particular bus route, dubbed the heaven to hell route, because of the sheer amount of people who would pile into the bus. This thing was totally packed. My roommate and I were standing face to face, with my back against one of the windows. This older man, who was fairly disheveled, messy hair and a puffy vest in the summertime, was standing behind her, and I see her getting physically uncomfortable and looking like she's about to cry. At first I thought maybe she was just uncomfortable, maybe not used to tight or crowded spaces. Fair enough, I'm not a fan either. So I switched spots with her, thinking maybe that'll help calm her down. Then I figure out why she looked like she was about to cry. This old creep had been pressing himself on her and grinding on her, and now I was getting the share of it since I gave her my spot. I was in total disbelief. Luckily, after a few stops, the crowding let up and we were able to get away from him, and both lean up against the window so our backs/butts were protected. I ended up loudly saying, "Holy crap, that guy was rubbing his chicken on me. What a pervert." This guy near us, who was around our age, just laughed and said, "I guess neither of you girls have been to Rome before, huh?" Still one of the worst memories from that trip. Ick. Story 83. Gained a stalker in Final Fantasy XIV. He wound up carving my name into his arm and posting it online. I wound up stopping playing and changed my Reddit username to ensure he couldn't dox me. I used a bot that changed all my comments and posts to garbage text before deleting them so they wouldn't be archived. 5 to 6 years later, he winds up on my server in World of Warcraft Classic, looking for me. Luckily, I've changed all my aliases and go by something completely unrelated, but I've had to completely append my online presence just to escape this psycho. Story 84. When I was 11-ish, I hung out with an older, wheelchair-bound blind woman who went to my church. Not at her home, just at church. She was so sweet and very grandmotherly towards me, and since my own were either dead or hated me because I was the daughter of my dad's second wife, I loved the attention. A guy started going to that church, and they ended up falling for each other and getting married. I was the flower girl in their wedding. I never liked the guy. He gave off a bad vibe, and while everyone else seemed to adore him, I didn't like to be near him. He kept encouraging me to come visit and hang out with his wife. My mom, who was a lunch lady at the time and had to regularly check Megan's Law to keep an eye out for creeps, ended up seeing him on the site. Essay of his own granddaughter. Well, she immediately went to the church elders because I wasn't the only kid he was trying to get close to. They said they knew, and because he said the power of Jesus healed him, they would do nothing. That's the creepiest encounter I've had with a man. The ones that turn a blind eye to a man intent on hurting kids because they didn't want to admit people lie about Jesus. My mom ended up spilling the beans to other couples and we left that church. Story 85. I was at work helping a couple in a different section of the store than I'm usually in. While I was helping them, another coworker was helping this 40-something-year-old creep in the same section. I didn't pay them any mind, but I did notice that the guy stood incredibly close to me at some points. Whatever, I finished my job and headed back to my side of the store, only to be told I needed to go hide in the back and not come out. Turns out, creepy man continued to go to the end of the aisle to look at me, and then rushed over to my section to demand to talk to me, where he then proceeded to get visibly angry when told I was on lunch. I started carrying a knife to work after that. Story 86. Oh man, I have so many stories to choose from. When I was in university, I lived in a house with 4 other girls. Our neighbor was an older gentleman. We started noticing our neighbor hanging out in our backyard a lot. This made us uneasy because most of our bedroom windows face the backyard. One day, one of the girls came home and found him in our yard again. He made up some excuse about trying to get his cat out of our yard and left. Then things escalated and one of my roommates caught him peeking in her bedroom window. By this point, I was fed up and ready to let him know we knew what was up. I approached him while he was leaving his house one day and let him know that I knew what he was up to, and if he didn't stop, I'd get the police involved. He counters with, "So what? I see men coming in and out of your girl's place all the time. Not that it effing matters, but we all had boyfriends at the time. Apparently having a sex life meant he was entitled to spy on us." Story 87. My ex and I were saying goodbye to his dad, who was a semi-functioning alcoholic who built furniture and cabinetry for people in the community as a job. He worked in a little shed behind their house, and we walked up to say bye. As I went in for a hug, he kissed my neck, like full-on kissed my neck with a little tongue. I immediately pulled away and walked to the car. I told my ex immediately, and he was really freaked out. We didn't go see his dad anymore after that incident, but his son tried to punch me in the face for having a female best friend I spent a lot of time with, so I dodged a few bullets, really. Story 88. I didn't realize how awful it was at the time, many years ago, but when I was 16 or so at my first job, my boss, 45 to 55M, would always compliment me on being smart and having a good work ethic, which was nice until he started saying I was pure as the driven snow. Just recently, I remembered at one point, he said something about imagining what he would do if he was young again, kind of implying that he'd bang me. Also told me I should watch Barbarella. I didn't know what it was about until recently, and that movie is all about sex, so inappropriate to talk to your high school employee about. I used to see him as a kind of uncle, but realizing how effing creepy that was makes me want to barf. Story 89. When I was 16, a family, mom, dad, 13-ish-year-old son, would come in somewhat regularly to the restaurant where I was the only server. The dad always acted super interested in me and asked a lot of questions, so he knew my age and that I didn't have my license yet. One night as I'm bussing the adjacent table, he asked me something random. I can't remember what now, but whatever I replied with, he said back to me, "Oh, what do you know anyway? You're only 16. Soon you'll be driving and drinking and having sex and stuff like that, since you're not already, right?" His wife and son just stared at their plates. I felt so bad for them. Story 90. Yeah, the guy that caused me to buy pepper spray for self-protection at the age of 17. Took the earliest bus home from town and an older 40-plus guy sat next to me, despite empty seats around. I ignored him by looking outside with my headphones on. He got off at the same stop as me and proceeded to walk with me trying to talk to me. Walk home is about 1 kilometer and nobody was around during that time. His chat was casual as he tried to connect with me by talking about the local school, but he smelled like alcohol, was overall unclean, and with a massive beard. I was terrified. I didn't know whether to run or to tell him to leave me alone as I feared the worst with nobody around and did not want to anger him. About halfway, he said he needs to take a turn to his street and asked me for my number. And no, I did not have the freedom to give a random one because he insisted on calling me so I'd know it's him. And then the worst part happened. He forcefully grabbed me and tongue-kissed me for what seemed like forever. He was too strong for me to even struggle. He then let go and left. I went home and cleaned my mouth over and over again. And then I learned never let my guard down and to carry a pepper spray with me. Story 91. When I was a freshman in college, I let a Tinder date pick me up and bring me back to his place. Idiotic effing move, I know. I'm also naive as F and seriously thought we'd be hanging out and getting to know each other. He was strung out on Adderall and wouldn't stop aggressively coming on to me. When I told him he was scaring me, he started freaking out, talking about, "Oh God, I effed it all up," then proceeded to ask if I would still finish him off. When I said, "No, you're scaring me," again, he started licking all over my feet and taking pictures and videos of me without my consent. Then he went into the bathroom and jacked off, then finally took me home. I never did that stupid crap again. That could have gone so much worse. I felt so powerless. I knew if he had wanted to SA me, I wouldn't have had any way to protect myself. Story 92. I shared a 3-bedroom apartment with coworkers, but at the time I was working 2 jobs and worked at my job more than the one me and my roomies all worked at. My roomies made a new coworker friend, but I never met him because I only worked 1 day a week. The friend started coming to the apartment almost every day for weeks, and turned out he was just trying to hang with me. We would flirt sometimes, but I wasn't really interested. One day he tried to make me kiss him, and I told him I wasn't interested in him. After that, he started coming to the apartment when he knew I was the only one there, and started insisting on sleeping over. When I asked him to stop coming over, he refused because he was there to see his other friends, so I ended up calling my brothers to threaten to beat him up to get him to leave me alone. Story 93. When I was 16 serving tables, a man I was waiting on told me, in front of his wife and 2 adult daughters, that my red hair makes my urine very pure and valuable, and in the old days, it would be worth a lot of money. My uncomfortable response was, "Okay, are you ready to order?" LOL. His family acted like they didn't notice he had just said that to me. It's not my worst encounter, but it definitely will stick in my mind for a while. This was like 10 years ago. Story 94. This was years ago, pre-cell phone era. I was 16 and had just gotten my license. I was driving home from work one night around 10, and this guy pulled up at the light beside me. I glanced over, and he was just grinning at me. A really creepy grin. When the light turned green, he just stayed right beside me, looking into my window, always with that leering grin. I sped up or slowed down, and he stuck with me, all the way down the highway towards my house. I was terrified. I finally got near a Walmart and got the idea to pull in, right near the entrance where there were people. He pulled away and disappeared. I never told anyone that it happened. Story 95. I was 15 and we were on our way to our Disney World vacation when we paid my stepmom's aunt a visit. I can't remember exactly how they were related, but anyway, they had an indoor pool. The aunt's husband kept making creepy comments to me like, "Why won't you get in the pool? I would really like to see you in the pool. Please come in the pool." He really wanted me in the pool and said all of this in front of everyone, so my step-siblings, my stepmom, my dad, and his wife. No one said anything about it. In fact, my dad actually tried to also convince me to get in the pool, which only encouraged the guy. Story 96. Similar, but I was 19 or 20. I went to Vegas/Henderson with a coworker friend and her sister to visit her mom out there. We stayed in her apartment. She had a really creepy/thug boyfriend. He looked like Phil Spector. Back then, I had a really good figure and comments/compliments all of the time. So my friend and her sister told me to meet her at the apartment pool. I jump in the shower and come out in my bathing suit, and the creep boyfriend got in my way and said, "I see how you look at me. You think you're hot crap," or something to that effect. I was terrified. I immediately got SA vibe. I never told my friend, but was stuck there with her for a few more days. Dude/the mom were in their 50s? He was a blackjack dealer out in the desert. I was so afraid he would kidnap/kill me and dump me out there. I'm now 50 myself and have tons of stories of my 20s and 30s. I'm no longer with a good shape, but huge boobs, and now those perf comments make me want to cry. Story 97. This wasn't me, but one of my housemates. In the first few weeks after my housemate moved here, she was being followed home by a guy. She was really scared, and she was really creeped out by him. We found out when she asked us where she could buy pepper spray, which is not really allowed in my country, I think. But this wasn't even the creepiest part. One of my other male housemates just kind of dismissed her feelings by saying that it's normal and, quote, "it's what guys do, and girls shouldn't be outside by themselves anyway, because then these things happen." We didn't really see him after that anymore. Story 98. When I was 16, I worked at a resort where people would come from all over my state to work. There was this one guy, mid-20s. This in itself was odd. Most staff were late teens unless you were management and had less seniority than me. Coke bottle, glasses, to an unhealthy liking to me. Would get on my shifts, try to work in my area, and try to get me alone. I started dating one of the other staff members, and he got pissed. Got more aggressive at me, trying to constantly touch me, would swear and threaten my BF. Management did nothing, still put me on a shift, until we were told to grab stock, which meant entering the massive storage area. When we got there, he shut the door and grabbed me, started to kiss and grope me. I screamed my head off, and thankfully one of the chefs heard and pulled him off me and gave him a solid ass whooping. Police were called and charges laid. A-hole ended up an attempted SAer and a child offender. Story 99. I was sleeping over at a friend's house, mostly guys. One guy was there that wasn't really part of our friend group. I only knew him from high school. We had all drank a decent amount and went to sleep. I woke up to the guy I barely knew caressing my head. I was freaked out and immediately was like, "What are you doing?" And he wouldn't stop repeating, "Just come to bed with me," while trying to get me to move into the room he was sleeping in. It took the other guys waking up and yelling at him to get him to stop. He may have been drunk, but still a mega creep. Story 100. I've had a lot, but this by far is the worst. One time when I was 16, I was at the mall with this girl that I made friends with the day prior. I thought that she was cool and really funny. Maybe about 10 minutes into the hangout, she said, "Hey, do you mind if I invite some of my friends?" And I thought this was cool, because I get to meet more people. The friends she decided to invite were a 27 and 45-year-old man. Both wore clothes and shoes that had holes in them and obviously did a lot of drugs in their free time. I was very uncomfortable, but at first they didn't pay attention to me, so I thought it was funny. But then we found a sitting area, and this girl started texting me from across the area to sit in the 27-year-old's lap. I kept saying no, and she wouldn't let up. She then starts to sit on the 45-year-old's lap and make out with him. This is in a public mall. I'm freaking out at this point, and I'm trying to keep the 27-year-old occupied with small talk so he doesn't get any ideas. Finally, he sits down on the couch and pats the area next to him for me to sit down. He was a big dude, and I didn't want to make him angry, so I just did. He pulls me onto him, and this dude literally smells like ass. Extremely pungent. I can't text my friends or my dad because he could see my screen. So I'm stuck. At some point, all three of them are coaxing me to come back to their house so that we can do some drugs and have sex, asking me to lie to my parents about where I'm going so that we can, quote, have some fun together. I immediately dart up right then because I got a text from my dad and the guy immediately says, "You're not going to give me a goodbye kiss?" I didn't say anything and I ran out and immediately started crying. We called the police and I filed a report, but nothing came of it, as expected. The girl texted me the next day with just an, "I'm sorry, I avoid them all now." Story 101. Walking in the supermarket at 14 years old, and there are two men following me saying, "Wow, look at that ass. I hope it's a girl." I had a short fro at the time. Was a flat-chested slim girl with nothing but ass. I'm 66 years old, and that crap still rankles me to this day. Oh, and when I was about 7, I had on my favorite multicolored shorts, and a man said to my mother, "Oh, she got some pretty legs." I never saw those shorts again. Evidently, she didn't like the way he said that. I was effing 7. Story 102. When I was 24, I was waiting for the bus. Guy walks up, really good looking, well dressed, small talk. Asks if I knew when the bus was coming. I said, "I just got here. You know just as much as I do." More small talk. We talked about weed. He said, "Oh, I have some if you want to smoke." I replied, "Nah, dude, it's fine. Plus, I don't have any money on me to pay for it." He jumps at this. "Oh, you don't have money? You want money? Are you hungry? Do you need food? Do you need a fix? Come with me to my car." Literally pointing down a dark, crappy alley. I'm like, "Aren't you waiting for the bus?" His effing face just drops and said, "I'm waiting for my cousin to get off the bus." Sure. He's still trying to get me to come to his car. And my dumbass couldn't stop myself, and I go, "Is this your first time trying to kidnap someone?" And he just looked at me shocked. We stand in silence. Bus comes in, I get on, I sit at the window seat, and we stare at each other even as the bus is leaving. His cousin didn't get off the bus. 2 years later, I'm speaking to a girl who had a similar experience at that same bus stop around the same time. Yeah, this is hilarious. Just call the guy out for being a creep. Or, have you ever kidnapped anyone before? Am I your first attempt? Because you're doing a really piss poor job. Good for you, girl. And then to just stare him down as the bus slowly peels off away from the station, that's freaking hilarious. Awesome story. Story 103 was working at an outdoor sports store. One of the managers asked to speak with me. I thought I was in trouble. I followed him to a storage area, then thought he wanted me to organize or something. He closed the door behind him. I immediately went into panic mode so bad my blood pumped into my ears so loud I couldn't focus. He said something about kissing me, and all I could do was shake my head no and beelined for the door and ran back to my department. I'm pale-skinned, so my face and neck were bright red from the blood rush. My department lead asked if I was okay, and I just said I needed to relax in the back for a minute. I never told anyone, and I should have. When I was about 10, walking home at night, this guy tried to stop me asking for something. Old Chevy S10 style vehicle, loud as hell. Rolled down his window and hollered. I stopped but didn't get too close. I didn't like his smile, so I shook my head and ran home. My elementary school announced him as a kidnapper creeper 3 days later, and there was a manhunt for him. Apparently, when uncomfortable, I panic and I run, no matter my age. Story 104. I was driving from the Bay Area to small town Oregon. My first time doing a rideshare, driving my own car, and splitting the gas with an older hippie dude. While going through rural Oregon in the middle of the night, I saw a car ahead with no lights on pulled to the side of the road near an embankment. The car was parked a little closer to the road than it should safely be. Since no cars were around, I veered into the other lane while passing, just to give a little room in case there was anyone in/around the car that I didn't see. A couple of minutes after this, a cop car speeds up behind me with its lights on. My passenger was asleep with the seat slightly reclined, and I woke up to let him know we were getting pulled over. The cop started walking up to the passenger side of my car, and I saw a visibly surprised expression for a moment when he notices the guy in my passenger seat. I roll the window down, but he almost seems like he's lost his words. It was really weird and uncomfortable from the moment he noticed my passenger, so I asked what's going on, since I knew I'd been driving the speed limit, and he says he saw me veer into the other lane when I passed his patrol car. I explained that his car had been a little too close to the road, so I wanted to give him some room in case there were any passengers around. Then he stands there like he isn't sure what to do, and asks for my license. He doesn't run it or go back to his car at all, but instead writes my full name and address on his hand and gives it back. I didn't get any kind of ticket or warning, and that was that. I get back on the road and my passenger and I sit in total silence for a few minutes before he says, I'm really glad I was here with you. Something was not right with that situation, and I could tell he wasn't expecting to see me in the car with you. I don't want to scare you, but I felt very uneasy. It was almost a relief that he said it first, because I had the exact same feeling. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't seen anything other than a few semi-trucks for a couple hours at that point. Anything could have happened, and no one would ever know. I felt sick to my stomach for the rest of the drive, and I now plan ahead, so any long trips alone through rural areas or during daylight. After this and another very scary rural highway incident, I'd rather be safe than sorry. Story 105. I was at an anime con, barely 15, walking in a simple love life cosplay and rocking a free hug sign. I had already collected a good 80 hugs by now. This guy, about 27, that already hugged me, noticeably long, but I didn't want to think anything about it, came back and spread his arms for another hug. Fine. Yuck. Nothing weird. He could have also forgotten. I gave him the hug and he does not let go. He stood there for a good 4 seconds already, and with his arms around me, he squeezed me in more by my waist, pushing my chest basically into him, his second arm getting alarmingly more low. I try to push off. He doesn't budge an inch. Finally, another friend of mine noticed, who's a whole 6'3" tall and muscular, luckily stepped in and gave him the death glare. He let go after another second, which felt like an hour, and looked annoyed as he walked off as my friend kept his still angered eyes on him till he was completely gone. This is why I will never wear that sign if I'm in a revealing cosplay again. Story 106. I went to high school with a guy who was obsessed with me. He tried to SA me at a party once, but I got away and locked myself in a bedroom all night. Years later, I was at a nightclub with my boyfriend and this guy saw me. Instead of coming to say hi, he came up behind me and stuck his hands up my shirt. When I spun around was the first time I had seen his face in like 2 years, and it absolutely terrified me. My boyfriend ended up punching him and we left the bar. Story 107. I worked at a shoe store in a pretty busy mall for a year right after graduating high school. Probably 6 months into working there, a middle-aged man came into the store looking for a pair of Oxfords. At first, he seemed like a normal guy. He asked me for help trying on some of the ones I brought out for him, claiming he was old and was having difficulties. I've had to help plenty of customers, especially kids and the elderly, so I thought very little of it. It wasn't until I noticed that he kept squirming around while I helped tie his laces that I thought he was odd. My coworker came and grabbed me suddenly and told me to go to the back room because our manager needed to speak to me. He then told the customer he'd be helping him, and the customer was visibly upset. In the back room, my manager explained that every time I looked down at what I was doing, the man would over the pants fondle himself. I was in disbelief, but the CCTV was proof enough. We reported him to mall security, but he claimed he was scratching an itch. I was furious, but for the next several months, he would come into the store and try to engage in small talk with me, and I had to put on my customer service face and be polite when brushing him off and ignoring him. Even though we reported him to mall security several times, nothing could be done about him. He didn't show up every time I worked, but he would only come in the store if I was. Otherwise, he'd leave as soon as he noticed I wasn't there. My last month working there, I was closing the store with one other coworker. When we parted ways, I went my usual way to my bus stop and noticed a person walking the same direction as me, a bit behind. It was the creep, and he quickly sped up and grabbed my shoulder from behind once he established that there was no one in the vicinity. Sucks for him, because I may have seemed timid at work, but I'm not in reality. I started shouting at him and pushed him off. He laughed, called me baby girl, and tried to grab my arm, so I elbowed his face and kicked him in the groin. Called the cops, and he was still crying on the pavement when they picked him up. Story 108. Well, I'll be honest, I guess. Trigger warning for assault. Some heavy descriptions here. Wildly naive and inexperienced 15-year-old me had a crush on a 22-year-old man. We had made out drunkenly at a party once. He added me on MySpace and put me on his top friends or whatever. Wrote to me and groomed me. A few months later, I was on a trip in a nearby city and hit him up to hang out. He drove out and I left my group to hang out with him. He'd brought a handle of vodka, and when we got back to his car, he passed it to me and I started swigging. He drove us to another man's house. I remember hanging awkwardly in the entryway for quite some time when the guy whose house it was brought me a red plastic cup to drink from. I remember it tasted weird. Then there's this big blank in my memory. Next, I vividly remember being half carried along the sidewalk, seeing my shadow from the city lights. Me slumped sideways, being half dragged with no shoes on. Next, I remember we're back in his car. I'm semi-conscious, unable to speak, watching everything, frozen. He pulls down my pants, pulls off my underwear. I still remember which ones. They were too big for me because I wanted to wear adult panties, but I was tiny. You can guess what happened next. Wish my body could forget the feeling. I remember him saying, "Did I get any on ya?" afterwards. Then he let me out of his car and I staggered alone round the block to my hotel in my socks. Was in the city for a special event, but slept through the entire next day and missed everything. I blamed myself, told no one, suppressed the memories. 12 years later, something finally shook the memories loose, and I was finally able to understand that I was SA'd, and it wasn't my fault. I have lots of mutual friends with this person, and none of them know. Believe survivors. Story 109. When I was 21, I dated this woman for about 2 months. She did not handle me moving on very well, and she would come by my house and call me from different numbers. Here I am, 36 years old. I've moved several times, been married, changed my name, changed my place of work, and she still attempts to contact me through social media platforms from time to time. Creepy AF. Story 110. I, 25F, was living in France sharing a flat with 3 guys. 2 of them I had a great friendship with. The other was younger and a bit of a bum. He spent most of his time outside, but sometimes invited his odd-looking friends to smoke weed and drink on the flat. I never liked it and told him a few times, which meant they'd do it, but simply in his room. One night, I came back home from having drinks with work friends. I went straight to my room, got in my PJs, thank God I put on long trackies, and slept. I never locked my door because I never felt unsafe. Suddenly, I wake up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling. There was someone in my room. As I start to gain consciousness, I realize this person, a guy, was full-on groping my ass. When he realized I was waking up, he sprinted out of the room like a effing coward before I was able to do anything about it. I fully wake up, realize that a effing creep was groping me in my room whilst I was sleeping, and storm out. I hear music coming out of my weird roommate's room. Knock loudly. He opens the door and I realize that he's there with one of his friends, and immediately know it was his friend who was in my room. I accused him of what he did, but they were both so stoned to come to terms with it. I later found out his friend had done coke and kept telling my roommate that he, quote, was going to go take advantage of me, or something along those lines, but thought he was joking. Apparently, his friend disappeared for a while, but I didn't think he actually gone into my room. F that crap. Story 111. That night, a guy who likes to text me every 6 months just to know if I'm single or not came again at midnight. What was cringe? He was talking in poem style and stuff. He asked again if I had someone in my life, so I trolled him by saying, there is someone in my heart, I confess. He's 2 years older than me, and effortless. I effed him so many times. Hard to translate without losing the original meaning, haha. Sorry for the bad grammar. Story 112. When I was 13, my best friend at the time was seeing a much older guy. I believe he was in his late 20s. My friend was actually a few months younger than I was. She came to my house to spend the night, and my parents had our camper in the backyard, and we wanted to sleep over out there. She invited her boyfriend and one of his friends to come see us. I knew this was happening, and I knew my parents were very strict, and I was terrified to get caught, but didn't want to seem uncool. They came, her and her boyfriend quickly started messing around. This was not my scene. I was very much a tomboy. His friends started messing around with me. I don't remember a lot of the beginning, but I do remember because I was such a shy kid. I basically said just enough words to him to have a bare conversation. He began kissing me and then ate me out. I was visibly uncomfortable. No movement, no words, no sounds, but I did not ask him to stop. I wasn't scared of him. I was just very shy and very scared my friend would get mad. I felt guilty for a very long time that I didn't ask him to quit, but to be honest, I don't know that I really knew how. I haven't fully processed this until now, and it's really the first time I'm telling anyone other than the boyfriend I had at the time. He confronted this person, but he was told that I wanted it, and so I became a liar to him. I found out later that he was 31 years old. Okay, there's just so much to unpack here. What are guys in their late 20s/31-year-olds doing? Dating, I'm putting air quotes around that, dating 12 and 13-year-olds, let alone hooking up with them and eating them out. And then for, the poster here's boyfriend, who I'm assuming is also about 12 or 13, to confront a 31-year-old man, like, honestly, what do you think that's going to accomplish? Just a total mess all the way around. That's just a horrible case of SA. Super gross. Story 113. Here's a few, because I have nothing better to do, lol. Some dude DM'd me when I was 11 or 12 asking me if I wear a bra. An 18-year-old asked me for my snap when I was 12/13. It was obvious that it was because he liked me. It wasn't a friend thing. I had spoken to him before and he asked me. 2 weeks later, he messages me saying, "Hey, Kat, my name is Catherine and that's what everyone calls me. No one calls me Kat." I thought it was creepy and blocked him. My best friend's brother sexually harassed me when I was 14. He accused me of cheating on him when I asked another boy in our class for a marker. We were not dating and never will be. And a few days later, he made jokes where he basically said, "I'm the only one allowed to make you orgasm." A kid in my class went through my phone and computer while I was in the bathroom, found a selfie of me, showed his friends, found adult films in my private browser, made fun of me for it, then outed me to my class as a lesbian, even though I'm not, and fetished me for it. Story 114. I have a lot of tattoos, which gets me a lot of unwanted attention. So I was in the grocery store one time wearing shorts, walking around with my cart, minding my business, and a complete stranger walked up to me saying how I had nice tattoos, and then grabbed my inner thigh to, quote, get a better look at my tattoo. I immediately slapped his hand and screamed, "What the F is wrong with you?" He looked so confused as to why I was so upset. He basically touched my lady parts in the process, so I yelled, "Do that again," and I'm yelling SA. The manager of the store heard me yelling and asked the man to leave. I do not understand the audacity of some people. Story 115. I worked with a guy for a few months. He threatened to beat and SA me since I did not have children. He did this in front of the shift manager. I repeatedly reported him to HR and he would continue with his threats. The last full weekend I worked with him, he sang about shoving his chicken up my ass to the 2 new women on the shift. He also threatened another employee that he would do the same to her and drag her back to her home country. He also threatened to SA a few minors as well. The parents of the minor who he targeted most had both gone to HR and corporate since this was a franchisee. Both entities refused to do anything unless he did something. I heard through the grapevine that he was fired about 2.5 months after I left, and not for sexual harassment. Story 116. I was in a mental hospital for an attempt on my life, and there was this guy. I think he was 17 and I was 14 to 15. It started when we had gym time, and there was a little corner of the room by the doors that had no cameras. He asked me to go to the corner with him so that he could see my breasts. I'm a bigger person, so I have big honkers in general. Anyway, we were at this corner because I was a dumbass and I followed him. He made a motion and he was like, just do it really quick so I can see them and touch them. I didn't because it was time to go back, and I'm glad I didn't. The second incident was when we were sitting side by side in the living room area, and it had a TV and chairs and tables, things like that. We were sitting together and he touched my thigh. I have bigger thighs as well, unfortunately. I scooted away, obviously uncomfortable, and he scooted closer. He looked at me and was like, I want to try something. So I was like, okay. And he looked around. No one else was in the room. And he brought his arm up and smacked me full force on the chest so he could watch them move from the slap. I quickly covered my chest and was like, what the hell? I scooted away and left the room to go sit in the hall where there were others. The third incident was actually just before he had slapped my chest. He had dropped his pencil on purpose between my legs so he could bend over and get closer. The fourth incident as well, it wasn't really an incident per se. We were sitting together in the same room a couple of days later, and he had written something on the chair. I forget what it said, but I can remember it was inappropriate and made me uncomfortable. That was the last I would take. I'm not the best at telling people no, and I felt like I couldn't because he was older. I told the staff everything that had happened, and because he was blocking the view of the camera, they didn't have any visual proof. I ended up going to a room with some staff and telling them the things he had said and did to me. And they put us on a 10-foot, where two patients cannot come within 10 feet of each other at any time. We were walking in the hall and I was ahead of him, and I saw him coming towards me. I didn't say anything at first, but he looked pissed off. His face was red and he just looked all over angry at me. He leaned in and whispered, "Did you say anything?" Scared to say yes, I did say something, for fear of what might happen. I said, "No, I did say crap." One of the staff saw us closer than 10 feet and called out his name and, "Hey, 10 feet!" And he backed off. That was my first encounter with a creep when I was 14 to 15. Sometimes I still think about it. I'm 17 now, so I feel like I should have let it slide long ago. And I keep trying to tell myself it didn't happen or it wasn't a big deal. This was an extremely repressed memory in my mind, and I had almost forgotten about it until now. Story 117. This happened about 5 summers ago. It was the summer before I went off to uni. It was the technically morning of the huge solar eclipse. You know, the one Trump looked up at without glasses. Anyway, my buddy had parties at his house every weekend because his parents would go up to their cottage. The parties were basically a bunch of our guy friends smoking weed, playing beer pong and video games with me and my 2 girlfriends. I live in the same neighborhood as my friend, just a couple blocks away. Usually, 1 or 2 of the guys would walk us back to my house at the end of each night, since they lived around me and didn't want us to walk alone in the dark. But this particular night, we chose to Uber because we were too intoxicated to walk home. We were really cross-faded, so my recollection of this story isn't crystal clear regarding all that was said. So our Uber pulls up to my friend's house at around 3 a.m., and me and my 2 girlfriends walk up to the car to get in. It was a minivan. We were still holding our coolers in our hands, as we were too gone to realize. I opened the door to the back seat, and the driver immediately gave off really weird vibes. He looked at me and had this look on his face, an almost Kubrick stare-esque look, but sort of smiling too. He had long black hair and a ponytail, a beard, and was wearing a neon yellow tracksuit. He also had some type of European accent, but I couldn't tell what kind. I'm Slavic, so I know it had to maybe be Portuguese or Italian or something because it didn't sound familiar to me. He looked at me and did the elevator with his eyes, saying, "I like your shirt," and winked. For starters, I was 17, and this man seemed around late 20s/early 30s. Second of all, I barely had much of a shirt on. I remember I was wearing a low-cut crop top, so my boobs were obviously out. Again, I was really crossed, so I just brushed it off and laughed. Me and my friend sat down in our seats, and the driver turned back and said to us, "If we get arrested, you guys are going to jail," gesturing at our open drinks. Again, we were really gone and didn't really give a F, so we just laughed, and my friend said something along the lines of, "Don't worry, we'll be low-key," or whatever. So he drove off, and I noticed that at the stop sign where I would usually turn left to go home, he turned right. He had a GPS with him, but was clearly ignoring it. I thought he was maybe just cutting through the neighborhood in a different way, so I just went with it. I know the area really good. There's like 5 alternate routes back to my place. Suddenly, we end up on the main road, the complete opposite direction of my house. As we headed under an underpass, I turned to my friends and said, "Guys, he's going the wrong way." I looked at my friend who ordered the Uber, thinking she might have put the wrong address or even her own instead of mine by accident, and she flashed me her screen. She had my address as the drop-off point. I guess the Uber driver caught on to us and turned around and said to us, "Do you guys want to go to the school?" We all looked at each other confused. No, we want to go home," said my friend. "But all the kids I drive want to go to the school, the big parking lot. That's where I take them," the man said with a creepy look on his face. We knew what school he was talking about. It was our high school, just up the road. It's conveniently located in the middle of a huge field, by the way. All the kids go there, he emphasized. I remember the looks of horror on my friends' faces. "No, drop us off now," my friend demanded, even though we were still driving down the main road. There was a 24-hour grocery store coming up, so I panicked and yelled, "Drop us off at the grocery store right now." He glared at me in the rearview mirror and turned into the plaza. He dropped us off at the grocery store, and we didn't even think of looking back to see him drive off. We just ran inside to safety, or so we thought. Minutes later, as we're pacing down an aisle, trying to order another Uber, we live in the suburbs, so finding an Uber at 3 a.m. isn't always easy or quick. We see the Uber driver walk past our aisle. I don't think he saw us, but we immediately made a run for it. He then saw us and began to follow us from afar. Soon enough, he made his way closer and closer and closer. We pretty much sped through every aisle, trying to get away from him. My friend got a notification that a driver was on his way to pick us up, and he was like 2 or 3 minutes away. We decided to go wait at the front of the store, still inside by the exit doors. Roughly 30 seconds later, the man comes up to us. With a bewildered look on his face, he says, "You girls want me to drive you home?" We all went pale. "No, don't worry about it. We have a ride," my friend said. "No, it's okay. I can drive you guys home," he insisted. "No, I said we have a ride. It's on the way." That seemed to anger him. "What, you ordered another Uber? What about me?" he said. He was standing very close to us too. I don't remember his face completely, as I was so high my eyes were barely open, but I remember the smile he had on his face the entire time he was with us. That eerie, nasty smile. "We have a drive," my friend snapped. The man walked away. The Uber was 1 minute away, but it seemed to be stuck at the red light at the intersection to get into the plaza we were in. We were watching the map on the Uber app on my friend's phone in complete fear. This felt like the longest couple minutes of my life, and I was scared as hell. We turned around to see if the Uber driver left the store, but there he was, about 15 feet behind us, standing very close to the cashier who was standing by a display. The poor kid looked super uncomfortable, but we saw that the driver kept constant eye contact with us as he was talking to the cashier, pointing at us several times. Suddenly, we saw the Uber pull up in front of the store. We sprinted out of the store, not looking back, and hopped into the car. And I yelled, "Drive, drive, drive, and lock the doors!" The new Uber driver gassed it, and we were on the way home safely to mine. He asked us if we were all right, since we were clearly being frantic. We explained the story, and he told us to report it as soon as we got home, and he would file a report or witness statement or whatever himself, too. He even said he'll stay in front of the house until we get inside to make sure we're safe. We thanked the man. We were super scared that the previous Uber driver would follow us, as he had my address from when he was driving us earlier. I made sure we locked all the doors, windows, and everything once we got inside. I put the security alarm on, and we reported the incident to Uber via email. The next morning, we woke up to 5 missed calls from Uber, and an email apologizing, refunding our tips from that night, and a statement saying that the driver will be pulled off the road for Uber as they investigate. We never heard back from Uber regarding the creepy driver, but I hope to never see him again. What's really creepy is that a few months after that, a younger girl I work with, she was 16 at the time, told me a creepy guy kept hitting on her and making her uncomfortable one night when she was closing alone at the smoothie bar we work at. She described him as early 30s, wearing a neon yellow tracksuit. I felt my stomach drop. I immediately said, "Black hair, beard, accent, was he wearing a low ponytail?" And she shuddered and said yes. I still get chills thinking about this man. So we got a full-blown chapter out of a novel for this, and I felt like I was reading a Goosebumps book or something. That's certainly very creepy, but glad that nothing ultimately came of it, other than the guy still being out there creeping on other people, apparently. Story 118. Most of my worst run-ins are basically adult stories, but it was good men and women that got me out of those situations. Being 12 and essayed by juggalos. Saved by a guy who would later carry our football team to victory. Only 15, and he had them crapping themselves to get away. Being 14 and assaulted, another girl beat him over the head with a brick to try and get him away from me, and a man came running towards the screams to chase him off after the would-be SAer turned on her. Being tricked into a dangerous situation and stranded in a rough area after dark with the tornado sirens going off when I refused to party with a friend of a friend, a kind stranger used his phone to call my parents for help. A friend in a similar situation was given shelter in a store until help could arrive, even though it kept the guy there 2 hours after closing. Story 119. For some reason, when I try to not be a creep, it comes off as very creepy. I'm leaving work one day and tried to help someone out, only to feel like a huge creep. A woman came out of the nail salon by my office and said her car broke down. First creep move. I pull a few dollars and start to hand it to her before she can even finish her story. It was a long day at work. She says, "No, I don't need any money. I just need a ride home before my kids get home and they're locked out of the house." I asked where she was going and it wasn't very far, so I told her I would give her a ride. Second creep move. When we get on the road, I say, you shouldn't ask for rides from strangers. It could be very dangerous. I was being sincere, but I didn't realize how scary my comment sounded until after I said it. Lots of awkward silence after this. Third creep move. We pull up to her house, and as she's thanking me, I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to give her more advice that would come off as threatening. You should have people drop you off up the street, so they don't know exactly which house is yours. Fourth creep move. She got out of the car and thanked me again for the ride, and I felt embarrassed for how everything went down and finished off with a "see you later," which is a typical parting exchange between friends, not random strangers who you suspect might sneak into your home while you're sleeping. Plenty of creepy guys out there, which is why I try to go out of my way to make women feel not that way towards me, and this nervousness seems to bring out the worst choices of words possible. And this guy can't get out of his own way. Man, just shut your mouth. Talk about the weather, talk about sports, talk about the stock market, who cares? But my God, you literally gave 4. Now, to your credit, you realized after the fact that you messed up, but you gave off 4 insanely creepy vibes inadvertently. So yeah, less is more, dude. You don't have to give unsolicited advice. Story 120. 1. I was walking home from the park, 9 years old. This 30-year-old guy runs up to me, pulls out his hard-on and says, "Come with me, little one." Everything went black in my eyes, but I managed to run away. 2. I'm 10, on my way to school on an empty street when this older guy runs over to me from across the street and starts following me from behind, asking questions about my private parts and if I was a virgin. 3. I'm 14, waiting for a bus. A guy walks up and offers to have sex with him. When I say no, he starts yelling that I'm a whore. 4. I'm 17, same exact story. Old guy walks up to me on the street and offers to have a quick one in the back alley nearby. Tried to physically fight me when I refused. Thankfully, he only tried, so when I started walking away, he didn't follow me. Story 121. Not at all my worst run-in, but my favorite. I've had the "why don't you come sit in my lap" coworker, the "I own you because you're my employee and everyone gives me blowies boss," and the cooked out "I'm gonna get you" neighbor. But I had just moved to a big city and was doing some shopping at a big mall. I was alone and my phone died, so I was on alert when I noticed this guy had been in 3 of the shops I had just left. I went to a few other stores and he followed me to each one. I walked out of the building to see if he would follow me, and he did. Freaked out, my taco-filled body let out a huge fart, and the guy ran away. Literally ran away. Taco Bell might have saved my life, you guys. Story 122. I may have been filmed, photographed, followed, and groped, but the incident with this creep is the strongest in my mind. When I was in my early 20s, I was on a tram one morning. Not packed, but at least 15 other people on board. A 40-ish guy sat in front of me and started talking to me. So I pulled out a headphone, made some pleasantries, and put it back in. Strong, I don't want to engage energy, but he kept talking to me, telling me about the olives he made at home and how I should come and try them. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. He was getting louder. He then went on to tell me about how much chili he eats and that when he F's me, it's going to burn. He was standing over me and yelling at this point. No one on the tram even looked at him, or me. He got off at the next stop. I was disgusted and intimidated and really appalled that no one stepped in to help. I was just trying to get to a doctor's appointment. I often wonder what it would be like to just move around freely as a person in the world without worrying about or dealing with creeps and predators. Story 123. Once, a regular at the restaurant I worked at was having a drink at the bar whilst I was bartending. He looked me straight in the eye, smirked, and asked me, circa 5 other adults were listening, if I would ever consider going to France to breastfeed to old men. I was flabbergasted and said, "What? No, I wouldn't." He then kept asking me why not, and started telling me that I would make a lot of money doing this, and explained how sucking milk from a young woman's boob would keep these old men young. I was 15. If this were to happen to me today, I would effing report that disgusting bastard. Story 124. I've had guys use crowded conditions of public transit to rub up against me or grab me. I find elbowing them or stepping on their feet the second time helps. With an, "Oh, I'm sorry," sickly sweet smile, matched with "touch me again and you'll regret it" death glare, while saying, "Sorry, the train's really crowded." Though, be careful with that one. If they look deranged, it could backfire. Had several instances of being on a subway car while some guy finished self-pleasuring, but I think that's just New York City. All but once, there were other people on the subway car, and the one time I was alone with the creep, I changed cars to a more crowded one. And learn to always be aware of the empty subway car or the car with just one person. It's usually that way because the air conditioning is broken, and or there's a guy self-pleasuring, and or someone smells really bad, and or someone is deranged. Creeps yelling at me from cars and slowing down to follow me, starting at 12 until my 40s. In our 20s, my friends and I yelled back at some guys catcalling us on the street. They followed our car and tried to cut us off. Thankfully, there is a DWI patrol nearby, when it was legal to set up checkpoints. It wasn't a checkpoint, but I told my friend who was driving to slow down and the guys would probably be scared off. They were. They would have made a complaint, but my friend was driving a borrowed car on a learner's permit at night when she wasn't supposed to be driving, so that wasn't a can of worms we wanted to open. In my 30s, guy tried to follow me to my home and only stopped when I went to use a payphone, back in the 1990s when cell phones were more expensive. By sheer dumb luck, a muscular, tall dude came over to the payphone shortly after. He just wanted to use the payphone and was asking me if I was finished with the phone. I didn't know if the police would respond, so I just dialed my own answering machine to buy myself some time to figure out what to do. And I was standing there, trying to figure out what to do next. But from Creepo's perspective, it looked like tall, muscular dude arrived in response to my phone call, and Creepo took off really fast. I did say thank you to the tall, muscular dude. I had explained the situation and he offered to wait with me. Some women feel like getting older, etc. makes them feel invisible, and they're sad about it. In my 50s, I feel like it's a frickin' superpower and one of the benefits of aging. Except when some guy tried to cut in front of me in line at a hotel. But I spoke up, assertively, but not obnoxiously, and he tried to give me crap about it. Story 125. I was in Costco with my mom at maybe 15 or 16. I was wearing a baggy but flashy sweater. It was not sexy. My mom went to another aisle, leaving me to guard the cart. A guy comes by, pushing his cart, and says, "Wow, that's a sassy sweater. Are you a sassy girl?" I was confused by the wording, but his tone of voice and his possibly drunk face told me what a creep he was. I said, no, and he kept pushing his cart down the aisle, saying how sassy he bet I was. It was gross. Story 126. I had a few in my 20s, but the one that scared me was a random man who had stopped to ask for directions. A few hours later, nearing midnight, I hear a knock on my door. I was a single mom at the time who never expected company past 7, so I was alarmed from the start, but I stupidly answered it anyway. It was the man who had asked me for directions. He introduced himself, did some lines about how I had been so nice, and he found me attractive, so how about we go out for a drink sometime? Normally in fight, flight, or freeze situations, my body goes with freeze, but I also had kiddos sleeping upstairs, so Mama Bear took over and gave him a piece of my mind. He did the, "but I'm a nice guy" lines, but I didn't want to hear that. Thankfully, I never saw him again after that, and it didn't escalate to something worse. So someone's watching over me. Story 127. I was looking for a table at an outdoor cafe once, precariously holding a bowl of soup. This older gentleman was just relaxing, reading a book, and very kindly offered me a spot at his table. We talked about his book for a little bit, how nice the weather was that day, and where I worked. I was on lunch break from an antique shop a couple doors down. Later that day, I saw him standing outside the shop looking at me, and the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. And finally, he started pacing back and forth in front of the building during all our open hours. I brought it up to my managers and told her I had met him before and we kind of had lunch together. A couple minutes later, I overheard my two bosses talking and they said, "Don't tell her, it'll only scare her." And I was like, hi. And they let me know he was a very well known murderer who hangs around the area, had done 30 years in prison in another state for killing his wife. I had to get escorted home for a while. Story 128. I'm a 45-year-old male. Sorry, not a woman, but after reading a ton of these replies, I have something very serious to say. Parents, your fear and lack of care of telling your children what to do when anybody comes onto them, this is almost criminal. When I was married, my wife never taught her daughter crap, so I asked for this 9-year-old girl to scream. She screamed. It was pathetic, and I told her so. I told her to really scream, let it all out, and then she proceeded to almost blow my eardrums out. I was seriously in pain, but the first part of my job was done. Then we explained to her which parts of her body a family member, friend, neighbor, stranger, teacher, preacher was allowed to touch. Absolutely no part of your body. Thankfully, this girl was never SA'd and is a wonderful human now. My parents beat the crap out of me when I tried to tell them as a child that a trusted church member kept trying to touch me. I would have ruined my parents' good image in church had this guy been outed, so I got the punishment instead. So a few years later, when another guy at a different church tried to assault me, I kept my mouth and ass shut. Screw any of you who do not know how to protect your child from SAers. Screw you for telling them that they're just making it up. Take your children seriously. They're literally you in a new form. Story 129. Not me directly, but I used to work as a lifeguard at a pool club, and I always had creeps just staring and whistling at the girls. One time it was funny because it was an old dude that did it to another old lady, and later found out they were married, but usually it wasn't cute. I saw this dude just mesmerized by a girl's ass, just like he couldn't look away. Come to find out, she's like 11, 13 at the most. I usually make small talk with people if they want to talk, but I literally called the dude a creep when he came up to me. Story 130. I used to make conversation with the janitorial staff at work since I'd work late and run into them every few days. One guy in particular would perk up when I would make conversation, but I didn't think anything unusual of it. A few weeks of making small talk have passed when we're talking about a mutual photography hobby. He shyly invites me to go take photos with him at a popular nature reserve an hour from work. I laugh it off and decline, and we go about our days. The next 2 weeks, I have a lot of deadlines and don't make conversation as much, but I'll give the occasional wave or hello. One day, I'm walking to the bathroom at night when suddenly he corners me. His whole body is shaking when he asks why I've been avoiding him and whether he did something wrong. I try to make light of the situation and say I've been busy and that I haven't been trying to avoid him. He reluctantly accepts this answer and I say goodbye. Immediately, I walk to my desk, packed my things, and took an alternate route out of the building to go home. This was around the time I was leaving for another job, so I hadn't seen him again. I don't know whether he had malicious intent, but since that night, I avoid becoming too familiar with men at work. This story is tied with the time a drunk homeless man came up to me at a train station and harassed me, followed me onto said train, and continued to harass me with inappropriate questions for a good 30 minutes. At one point, he asked my age, and I lied by telling him I was 15. I was 20, to which he responded, 15? That's young, but I would still. Trailing off his sentence before another passenger on this half-full train got his attention by talking about the local sports team until we reached the next stop and everyone disembarked. A separate passenger kindly walked me towards my destination until we were certain I wasn't being followed. Story 131. 18 years old, delivering pizza. Drop pizza off at a house in suburbia. 2 little kids inside playing. Dad answers the door, tells me it's his birthday. His wife is out of town, takes the debit machine in the house and attempts to lure me in with it, telling me I should give him a birthday present. It was the tone and pressure to try and get me inside that was the most creepy. It was the most unsafe I've ever felt. Left crying. My boss called the cops when I got back to the store. They couldn't do anything because he didn't touch me and I was not underage. Story 132. The first was when I took a train home late one night and was stared at by a man who made me so uncomfortable I waited until the last possible minute to get off my train before the doors closed. Evidently, it wasn't quick enough as he also got off after me. I was a student with no money and was walking home from the station to my house as I couldn't afford the taxi fare and I had no credit on my phone. Back in 2008. He proceeded to follow me to the other side of the street, whilst I was acting like I hadn't seen him till I figured out what to do. I stopped and pretended to send a text to make sure he was following. He too stopped and stood back in a doorway, so I confirmed he was definitely following me. I yelled at him that I could see him and that he better F off, then proceeded to run up the road to a late-night supermarket where I told them I was being followed. They offered to call the police, but my teenager self started questioning myself about whether he was actually following me, so I hung about in the shop for a while and walked the rest of the way home. The other time was walking to work early in the morning in the dark, and a dude jumped out of the bushes in front of me, dropped his trousers, and started jerking off while staring at me. That was gross and terrifying. I also had a woman who got obsessed with me at my workplace and went a bit stalker for a while. Started playing football in the same team as me, would wait for me outside the office, message me weird things on LinkedIn, and would cry to a mutual friend about how she was crazy about me. So yeah, it's not always men. Story 133. Want a tour of terrible men around the world? The worst is obviously the man here in SF who followed me off a bus and tried to pull me into a dark alley. I was already super nervous about him. He gave off bad vibes, and it felt almost inevitable when he attacked me. Thank God I was wearing a super spiky ring. I punched him as hard as I could and nearly broke my own finger doing it. Screamed at the top of my lungs and sprinted a few blocks until I reached a brightly lit, crowded intersection. This was exactly 1 week after a totally different man in SF groped me on the bus. Love you, money. A group of guys literally stalked me around the streets of Florence, Italy. Like 6 or 7 dudes who followed me through winding medieval alleys and streets for like 20 plus minutes. I was straight up crying trying to escape them. For some reason, everywhere in that neighborhood was closed and I couldn't find anyone to ask for help. At one point, I thought I got myself into a dead end and I was panicking. Then I found an escape route and managed to get back into a populated area. I went back to my hotel and cried, and I've never been back to Florence. When I lived in Paris, a man on the metro pulled my headphones off my head to ask me where I was going that night. I stammered that I was going to meet up with friends, jammed my headphones back on my head, and then he started screaming at me that I shouldn't go out dressed like that if you don't want men to talk to you. Another man in Paris pulled up to me during an actual field trip. I thought he was genuinely asking for directions. When he realized I wasn't picking up his insinuation, he said in English, "What is so hard to understand? I want to F you." My teacher was standing directly behind me and screamed at him until his disgusting ass scootered away. I was on my way to lunch, literally dressed in an outfit so demure that I've worn it to religious services. I sat in the last car of the train, like an idiot. A man sitting between me and the rest of the train started self-pleasuring. We were the only 2 people in the car. I had to endure it until we got to a station and I was able to switch cars. To this day, I never sit in the last car of a train. One night during college, I was walking home from work one night and a guy started following me. I knew what was up, so I called my tall, pretty, burly boyfriend at the time to meet me and escort me home. The guy kept following us, even after my BF turned around and screamed at him to F off. Story 134. Once when me and a few other friends, all female, were going back home from an evening out. We were waiting for our taxi, and we all went to my house because we were all sleeping there. While in the taxi, the driver saw a car following us, and he told us to watch out. Well, there were 3 guys in the car, and they waited in front of my house for about an hour. I was watching from behind the blinds in the window because I was scared. Afterwards, I saw them cross my front porch, then go in the backyard, from where they tried to open the back door. I went outside with one of my friends and my huge German Shepherd and told them that I called the cops, and then they left. Another time, a dude asked me for directions and I told him, but he continued to walk in my direction, even though what he asked for was in the opposite direction. He ran up to me, grabbed me by my breasts. I pushed him and started running until I got to a mall. I was so shocked I couldn't even call for help, but thankfully he wasn't following me. I have a lot more, but damn, these 2 were so frightening. They changed my view of the world as a young woman. Story 135. I'm a trans woman, but I'll weigh in. I had heard that it happens to all women, but I honestly never thought it would happen to me. It was midday, and I was dressed modestly. I walked into a Walgreens or something to get a bottle of water when 2 guys got behind me in line and started talking about me. Most likely they didn't clock me, but I don't know. They whispered back and forth, and I could feel their presence. I don't know how to describe it, but maybe women in here can support that feeling. Anyway, finally, one of them speaks up loud enough for me to hear and says, "Yeah, she's not bad, but she's a bit tall for me." The other replies quickly, "Bet she'd be the right height on her knees." I've told women friends of mine, and some have even laughed about it and said, "Yep, that's the way it goes," as though it's no big deal. That's probably the saddest thing to me. Story 136. When I was in 5th grade, I had a violin tutor who constantly smelled like cigarette smoke. He would also address me as love or dear. Also, when correcting, instead of telling me where to place my hands, he'd grab them and move them on the fingerboard. I think that's what it's called. It really freaked me out because it was a private lesson, so it was just me alone in the room with this man. The room was also tiny, felt more like a closet, even to tiny 5th grade me. Eventually, my parents took me out of the private tutor lessons because they cost a lot. Only then did I tell them how much he freaked me out. Edit. Sorry for grammar issues. I've had a really crap day. Edit. I remembered another story about a guy in one of my classes in 7th grade. I had jokingly insulted me, and he graphically described how he'd SA me with a group of friends. I've had really bad experiences with guys. Story 137. Oof, I've got many from growing up in Mexico, where women are heavily objectified. Was walking down the street with a friend. We got catcalled by a bunch of construction workers in the back of a pickup truck. We were around 15 at the time. We yelled back at them to piss off, and the truck made a U-turn. The men in the truck started confronting us, telling us we shouldn't be wearing shorts like that if we don't want the attention. Luckily, a cop drove by, and we tried to wave him down. Of course he didn't stop, because Mexican police, lol. But the guy's truck drove away. Another time about a year later, I was walking home from a shift at a bar that ended at around 2 a.m. I was 16 working behind a bar because, once again, Mexico. The roads were pretty much empty since it was so late in a small town, and the only thing going on past 10 p.m. was that bar I was working at. So I noticed when a car drove past me going the opposite way. I never saw it turn around, but next thing I know, the car pulled into the reactional lane of the road for walking, biking, etc., and blocked my path. The man first kindly asked me if I needed a ride home. I declined, saying I was about 5 minutes away from home, which was true. He kept insisting, each time getting more aggressive until he yelled, "Just get in the effing car!" I ran the other way, across the street, and ran the rest of the way home, turning at a bunch of different side streets so I could lose him. I don't know if he followed me or not. It was terrifying since it was just him and me as far as my eyes could see. The same car thing happened to me a couple years later in a different city, but this car actually followed me all the way home and watched me go in. Luckily, I had 3 hardcore punk male roommates that just walked with me everywhere for the next couple of months and wouldn't let us girls answer the door unless we were expecting someone. I have many, many more.